We are on.
Okay, I would like to call to order the Special Finance Committee budget hearings, April 13th, 2021 at approximately 1:02 p.m. Can I have a roll call, please?
Certainly. Councillor Cassett Sanchez,
Here.
Councillor Villarreal,
Present.
Councillor Lindell,
Here.
Councillor Romero Worth,
I'm here.
Councillor Beta.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Okay, so the next is approval of the agenda. This is the first of several budget hearings. Today's agenda is a general overview by the finance director and members of the finance department. And then B is a community development department budget. And we are slated to go till 4 p.m. Are there any changes to the agenda for today, Ms. McCoy?
No changes, Mr. Chair.
Okay, any changes from the committee? Can I have a motion to approve the agenda?
Move to
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Can I have a roll call, please?
Yes. Councillor Cassett Sanchez,
Yes.
Councillor Villarreal,
Yes.
Councillor Lindell,
Yes.
Councillor Romero Worth,
Yes.
Councillor Beta.
Yes. Okay, so our agenda has been approved.
Mr. Chair?
Briefly, yes.
Before you get into the next matters, I just wanted to let you know the Water Conservation Committee meets at 4 this afternoon.
Okay.
And so I will need to jump off for that meeting. So hopefully we'll run as close to on schedule as possible. Just wanted to let
Okay,
you
thank
know.
you, Councillor. Yes, as part of my opening remarks as the chair, I will first and foremost try to keep us on time. It's I was talking with the mayor about it, and he said, it's like moving the wagons west. Don't get stuck in Kansas. So that's our job over the next 2 weeks, is to move the wagons west. But we will, at the same time, we will take the time we need on certain topics, and if there's certain issues, that is very important. But usually the budget hearings, in the years that I've been conducting them as the chair, kind of develops its own rhythm and cadence as we go, and we kind of find our way after the first couple of days as to what are the things we really hone in on and the things that we move along. And so I'll just kind of allow today to proceed. I will keep an eye on time, and we'll see what kind of rhythm we get into as a committee. So with that, is there anything from the committee before we get started? Okay, then let's go ahead and jump right into it. We'll start with our overview from Ms. McCoy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today, for the first portion of our budget hearing, we're going to share an overview with you. I'm going to ask Alexis to share her screen now. We have a PowerPoint presentation that's been posted to PrimeGov, as well as sent out to the council as well. So at this time, we thought it would be prudent to give you, given the changing economic circumstances based on the pandemic and the recovery period, we are going to be reviewing an economic update with you, presenting some economic facts, some economic projections and forecasts for the next fiscal year, which have served as the basis for our FY22 revenue projection. This is key for all of us to be able to have this as a baseline to understand the economic recovery that we are facing and how unprecedented that is, and how that factored into the increase in revenues for the City of Santa Fe's budget. We'll briefly highlight a few points on the FY22 expenditures, but really the detail will come in the coming weeks, in the next 2 weeks, as we review department by department the budgets with you. That being said, we'll wrap up discussing a series of budget amendments. As you've heard me mention plenty of times, The budget is a plan, especially 3 months as we are in now, 3 months before the fiscal year even starts. The budget is a plan. So we have a plan to be able to continue to make budget adjustments in the coming year in the event that the revenue forecast changes or in the event that our spending priorities change. So with that, I will, next slide, please.
Okay, and Mary, I want to go ahead and allow the committee and members from the governing body to, if they have a specific question on a slide, to be able to interrupt and ask that question. So just, if you can, raise your hand. If I don't see it though, feel free to speak up and, just say you have a question or a comment regarding something specific on the slide in front of us. Thank you.
So today for our economic update, we have joining us Dr. Riley White. Dr. Riley White has presented in front of the Finance Committee in March the FY21 economic update for us, which then informed our FY21 revised revenue estimates. We're very fortunate to have Dr. White joining our team with all of his years of experience in forecasting and modeling and analysis of national, state, and local economics to assist us in these economic updates. As we all know, after the past year that we have lived through, it has been an unprecedented circumstances, and we appreciate all the additional support that we have from Dr. Riley White to be able to work through the coming years and what the rebuilding and recovery period looks like for Santa Fe. So next slide. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. White to review his section with us.
Yes.
Okay, Dr. White, whenever you're ready.
I think he was in the waiting room, Mr. Chair. I just allowed him and promoted him to a panelist.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So Dr. White, if you want to kick off your section.
Great. Thank you so much, Director McCoy, for the incredibly generous introduction. It's been an absolute honor to work with the city on this. And I want to thank the members of the City Council, as well as the city representatives here with us today, as we discuss some of these important economic challenges. So let's start looking at this and looking forward. And overall, I hope, I know that this might be repetitive for a couple people, but we have some interesting things to report. So next slide, please. So a little bit about me. I'm a tenured associate professor of finance. I've got 15 years of experience modeling economic analysis. I used to be in banking, other things as well. I do budget forecasting, portfolio analysis, cryptocurrencies and financial technology recently, and have a bunch of other peer-reviewed publications that will put most people to sleep if you want to read it. But I'm grateful to be here, and using my prior experience, I was able to give a context as to where the revenue projections are going forward in the future. So next slide, please. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about sort of the national economic overview, and I want to reiterate some main points. The first is that in the last year, combined with the $1.9 trillion stimulus package that we had approved earlier this year, we have had a total of $5 trillion of stimulus spending across the economy. That's about 1/4 the size of our overall gross domestic product here in the United States. It's a very significant number, and it is an unprecedented stimulus. And the good news about this stimulus is that it does go through and help jumpstart a lot of the economic recovery scenarios that we've seen across the country. And the first thing is that with the passing of the recent stimulus, we're expecting our GDP growth to be the highest it's been in about 40 years this year, since 1983. And it's going to expect it. We've revised our numbers upward. It's about 6% per year. This is going to result in a couple of big things to think about. And one is that with interest rates continuing to be low, that makes a lot of different projects across the system. It makes lending money very cheap. It makes projects and expansion possible across the country, which means that we're going to expect a lot of residential capital spending and growth in the capital, so the aggregate amount of money we have in the system. And what this is going to do is this will have an effect at continuing to recover the economy, particularly in depressed areas. And the most notable has been travel and leisure, which has seen a massive drop-off in both usage and travel, as well as hiring. We expect that will be bolstered by expansion in consumer spending. To give you a sense of this, over the last historical savings rate in the United States prior to the pandemic was about 7% per year. The pandemic doubled this. We have a lot of pent-up demand in consumer expenses. And we expect that will carry forward and help bolster economic growth or increase economic growth in the next few years. And on top of that, we also have a Federal Reserve that is keeping monetary policy very easy. It's making it very cheap to lend. And the Federal Reserve sets one interest rate, which is overnight lending to large banks that we call the discount rate, but it has an effect on other rates in the system. And by keeping rates near zero, we expect this will encourage economic growth, a rapid economic recovery in the near future. Jerome Powell has signaled that he doesn't expect to raise this anytime soon. That being said, we do have some challenges. One thing is unemployment. Unemployment remains high. It is historically, every time we hit a financial crisis, we lay off people faster than we hire them. But we've seen progression here. Not only did many of you heard about the jobs report that we had in the last month, optimistic signs of economic recovery going forward. Persistent unemployment remains an area of concern. And one issue is, of course, when we lay off people in one area, there often might be a demand for hiring in a completely different area and not enough people to fill that. And that becomes an issue as well. Labor force participation also remains depressed. Labor force participation is the amount of people who are actually out there looking for jobs and working in the economy. And right now we're at a level that's below the pandemic. Many people, there are many sources in this. People will leave the job market to take care of children, to take care of elders. Elder care and child care are big factors. And it's difficult to say whether or not that recovery will be the same. But we expect that in the next year, we're going to continue seeing robust growth at a historically high level that we haven't seen in a very long time. Next slide, please. So one of the ways that we wanted to gauge this, and I want to give you a sense of this in kind of figuring out, how do we gauge economic recovery on the ground? And one way that we can look at this is especially in a city like Santa Fe, a city where I live, where we have a vast amount of tourist traffic each year. We want 2 million overnight visitors a year to continue, like we had prior to the pandemic. And the daily Transportation Security Administration checkpoint travel numbers kind of give us a gauge to whether or not people are traveling. If we look at the 2019 numbers, which is the numbers in blue, that's kind of that pre-pandemic baseline. How many people traveled in a given day? Ranges from about 2 million to 2.5 million, sometimes a little bit more in summer. Now, if we think about 2020, we can actually see in that yellow line that massive drop-off that occurred as the pandemic closures happened in March and April of last year. And that recovery remained rather muted for a few months afterwards, to a level of about 25 or 30%, what the 2019 levels were. But we've seen some cause for optimism in the first 3 months of this year. In the orange line, that reflects the actual numbers that we've seen through the first week of April. And we've seen the numbers recover from a position where passenger traffic was 1/3 of what it was in 2019 to a position where it was 60% of where it was in 2019 most recently. And if I continued this projection forward, and I projected these numbers here in 2021, we'd achieve just at that same rate, we'd be back to where we were in 2019 this summer. But what I did here is I provided a projection going forward in 2021 that factored in a bunch of other things, how fast people are going to reopen, other concerns about the economy, about consumer behavior in response to gradual reopenings across the country. And so what we end up with in a very conservative projection is looking forward, we expect travel numbers to recover to where they were back in 2019, very close to where they were in 2019 by the end of the year. Next slide, please. Now, bring it a little bit closer to home to give you a sense of the New Mexico economic overview. One big takeaway here, as I want to point out, is that we, of course, here in New Mexico, our labor market behaves differently than the rest of the country. We don't have a concentration of large publicly traded companies. We have a higher than average concentration of people who are working for the government, federal, local, and state governments than other parts of the country. And so consequently, our unemployment dynamics or our employment dynamics are a little bit more muted. So when there's a recession, our unemployment doesn't get as high. And in good times, it takes us longer to recover, and we never really approach the extreme low levels of unemployment that the rest of the country saw. But that gives you a kind of a context to where we're going. Right now in New Mexico, of course, coming off of the recession, we do have persistently high unemployment, particularly oil and gas sector. We're still down about a third in year-on-year employment. Leisure and hospitality, particularly concentrated here in Santa Fe, a large number of people are still out of work. Government and financial activities are also a little depressed. But we expect that what's going to happen is we're seeing right now, and to bring context into this, robust residential real estate growth. We expect as the pandemic starts lessening that this will result in improved inventory levels. In addition, the $1.9 trillion stimulus boosted consumer spending, and that affects Santa Fe directly in two different ways. The first is that not only does it provide a direct source of additional municipal support, but it also provides through the mechanism of direct checks to individuals, of which maybe 90% of Santa Fe households are qualified for. And if we do the math on that, that's about $100 million worth of additional economic incentives that are given to Santa Fe residents. Many of that will be spent, many of that will be saved, and many of that will be used to pay down debt. We expect overall, regarding the state's fiscal position, that the oil and gas sector will continue to recover slowly as people start demanding more gas. We expect oil prices to remain relatively high, which, as New Mexico, right now, we're historically last 2 years, we've been the third largest oil producer in the country, and that's a large source of state revenues. And we expect that will come back in some form to a high level. So overall, right now, we're still kind of a lot of unemployed people, but we are very optimistic in the next few months of the recovery. Next slide, please. So one of the things I like to look at, and to kind of reiterate this, looking at the unemployment dynamics of the state, the city, and nationally. So we know that historically, if we go back to the 2008 financial crisis, the recovery, of course, was very slow. The U.S. recovery, U.S. started with a higher unemployment rate. Obviously, the 2008 financial crisis started in the financial sector. New Mexico didn't have a high concentration of firms that were heavily involved in that. Unemployment in the country was higher than New Mexico through about 2014. But New Mexico's recovery was more gradual. It was more gradual. That's the orange line. And then Santa Fe is very seasonal. Here you can match it. And in the summer months, almost as economic activity increases, a lot more people are looking for jobs, and consequently the unemployment rate almost counterintuitively goes up. But there's a little cyclicality there in Santa Fe. Normally, it's a little bit better than New Mexico. In the couple years trailing the pandemic, it followed the US numbers very closely. And then the pandemic happened right there in 2020, 2021. Those sharp lines, rapid increases, rapid unemployment levels occurred across the leisure and hospitality sector in particular, but also government financial services across the system. And in 2021, we've seen some recovery in that level. We expect this will continue, and I projected these values forward. New Mexico should see continued improvement down to the 6% level through 2022. The US level, consensus estimates have put that forward, approaching 5%, and even some more ambitious economic consensus looks at more of a 4% unemployment. And Santa Fe will continue to improve along with the United States. And we expect that a lot of that will be driven by a return in consumer discretionary spending, leisure and hospitality spending, and tourism traffic, which is expected to improve drastically in the next year. So next slide, please. Thank you. So if we kind of bring it down to why this is important for Santa Fe, and in thinking about where economic growth is in the context of economic growth into the broader picture, what this means is there's going to be a steady recovery in tourism in 2021 and 2022. This means greater occupancy in hotels, Airbnbs, and the like, increasing lodgers' tax revenues accordingly. Also, when people visit town, they do spend money, and that leads us to higher gross receipts tax revenues. Also of notes, we've seen, as observed here, we've seen very low rates across the country have powered an appreciation in the real estate market. And the real estate market itself has been firing on all cylinders, and supply has remained very low and sometimes historically low, which means supply and demand, a lot of people demanding homes, a lot of people like to live in Santa Fe. That drives up the price of real estate accordingly. And it's happening across the country. And if we look at this, it's even happening internationally. And a lot of that is due, there's a lot of factors, low rates, of course, but also a lot of investment, a lot of investment agencies, people investing in properties and real estate, helping to drive up properties, as we've seen both domestically and internationally. Construction activity, I think, is really important to note. Mostly are incredibly unaffected by the recession among sectors. Not only is unemployment recovered in construction, but you're looking at a level of building permits, which is expected to remain high in the next couple of years. And public sector employment remains another source. It's still about 8% below last year. But again, stronger fiscal positioning means greater hiring. Next slide, please. And so one of the ways we look at this might be looking at, say, lodging in Santa Fe. Let's look at the amount of people who are staying in hotels and what those occupancy rates are. During the pandemic, I should say, in 2020, we saw those occupancy rates from STR data provided by the city drop to levels between 30 and 40% of where they should be in summer. That resulted in fewer revenues coming into the city. But as we project it, we've seen some sources of growth in January and February. As a percentage of where they should be this time of year, they're increasing. And if we project it forward, I created a model here that has 3 projections. A high level projection, which is a very optimistic projection, rapid growth, everything opens up, people come back, and tourism expands in accordance with the amount of pent up demand. That's the highest orange line. The lowest orange line is the most conservative estimate. This is we still living with a lot of different variants of COVID. We have a lot of different variants of this ailment, and economic activity remains muted because of either partial closures throughout the economy or moving backwards slightly. So I incorporated both of those outcomes. The middle line represents the best guess estimate of where lodging will be in Santa Fe this summer. As you notice, as we approach June, July, August, September, they're not at the levels they were in 2019, but they're getting there. They're close to being there, and they're within the ballpark of reaching them. And it wouldn't surprise me if we did see a more positive back on track towards the higher end as we approach the fall months of this year. So it's a very interesting thing, but it depends on a lot of different variables. Next slide, please. And to kind of give you the overall big picture here, and I want to elaborate and kind of summarize on what you've seen so far around the local economy and provide you with some takeaways. So first, pushed by an economic recovery, combined with $5 trillion of stimulus spending over the last year, will likely achieve the highest level of economic growth in the country that we've seen in the last 40 years. Secondly, we have pent-up demand and historically high savings rates. This will power continued improvements in consumer spending, and this will help all sectors improve, ranging from construction to tourism to investment spending. And thirdly, the gradual lifting of pandemic restrictions, increase in public vaccinations will drastically improve our tourist traffic, increasing city revenues, particularly both in GRT and lodgers tax. So over the last few months, I've been studying the effects of economic data like this on sources of revenue for the city of Santa Fe. The econometric models that I've used to factor in both use historical data as well as economic indicators, how and why different revenues respond in different ways to different economic conditions. So one of the things I found was the single biggest predictor of GRT and lodgers tax was the unemployment rate. In other words, how well the total economy was doing. And I also took into account several different models to produce projections that were representative of the most likely outcomes, informed by past data, current recovery data, anticipated future consumer behavior. So all these models ended up skewing very positively towards city projections in the next year or two. So when the interest rates remain low, and to kind of go back into this big point here, this encourages people to spend money, and this has different effects, right? So sometimes people buy homes with that money, that drives up the price of real estate. Companies build and expand their footprint, which encourage construction and hiring. And I don't want to ignore that there are two substantial risks going forward. The largest is certainly the ongoing pandemic. And despite, New Mexico's tremendous and heroic progress on vaccinations, additional variants can generate backwards progression on closures. Likewise, another concern that we have, or at least has been described, and even the field of finance and economics is relatively split on this, is the effect that the unprecedented stimulus will have to generate short-term inflation. And right now, the inflation numbers came out this morning at about a 2.6% annualized rate. And that was actually a little bit better than we thought it would be. And inflationary concerns usually have a mixed effect on municipalities. For instance, usually they increase the amount of revenues that a municipality brings in, but they also increase the amount of expenditures. And we have to go back in time before we've quite a number of years before we've seen significant inflation, and that's not currently expected. What is likely is that the first 2 quarters will have higher than anticipated inflation, higher than our 2% target, but then that will fall back down to normal levels we expect in the next year or two. Mitigating these risks have been a better than anticipated economic recovery to this point, including in the job market, and strong economic indicators that we've seen solidly throughout the last year. And so overall, that's kind of our overarching viewpoint of where we are right now economically, where these numbers come from, and where we're going with these values. So I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Questions for Dr. White? Councilwoman Villarreal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Dr. White, for the information. We had the same presentation last time in finance, and what I think was brought up by one of my colleagues about what this projection and forecasting does to people from the working class population. And so what I struggle with, these scenarios don't necessarily go into the details about how we're recovering, how the recovery will actually affect more working class populations, particularly women of color, because that's been shown across the country and in New Mexico that is the population that has been hit hardest by the pandemic and by unemployment. And so I guess I'm just curious how you could show that, whether it's through some kind of visual, because as you know, and we talked about last time, the housing boom, that will have great implications on working class, middle income folks who are just getting back into the workforce and also have not had wage increases due to the pandemic the last year. So those are things that I think about. Like, these are all, there is a connection. And if the economy does well, then our population is supported, but maybe not everybody. So I guess I'm just curious. I don't know how you could depict that in a slide or some visual for us into the future about what this will look like for working class folks.
Of course, in Councilor Villarreal, I'm so grateful for your point here. And I want to reiterate that you brought up some very, very crucial information, very crucial points that are absolutely true. The pandemic has affected different people differently, and it's been skewing. So many people who have the ability to work from home were obviously had an advantage over people who were not and ultimately laid off. And that's continued. And to kind of give a perspective on this, so in my next iteration, I will provide a little bit more context and detail about that as we expect this, especially for the city of Santa Fe. And I can go into more detail across demographics and other sectors as well. So I really appreciate your point on this, and I'll develop that forward. And right now, to give you kind of hints of this, of where we're seeing this, The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported in the first week on April 2nd, they reported their March job data across the country. And while unemployment improved for, across the country, it's remained solid for adult men, adult women, about 5.8% and 5.7% respectively. Among Hispanic populations, it's still over 7%, 7.9%. And it's higher across the system. And we're also seeing numbers that aren't even reported there. And those labor force participation numbers, we can only observe numbers where people are looking for jobs. That's where the unemployment numbers come from. And a lot of people have to leave the labor force to take care of kids, take care of family members in the crisis as well. So I'll provide greater context and information on that level.
Thank you, Dr. White. I just wanted to add in to answer Councillor Villarreal's question. I think a lot of the response part, the rebuilding piece to the question that you brought up will be highlighted in the next 2 weeks with the investments and the priorities that the city has made. Two that we'll be reviewing, one that we'll be reviewing with you today is the additional investment of $3 million in the Affordable Housing Trust Fund in FY22, in addition to the $3 million investment that we made in the current year. We've also allocated $75,000 for an eviction hotline in the budget as well. So we'll be reviewing that with you with our community engagement budget next week. So I think it goes hand in hand to recognize the adverse effects of the economic conditions and the pandemic, but also what the city's response, what this budget contains for us to be able to respond as a really kind of a series of steps. First, we started out with the CARES Act funding, that $17.5 million, and then what is included as priorities in our recurring FY22 operating budget. But then going forward, we have additional federal funding that today you will see reflected in the affordable housing budget as well, with all of the additional CDBG dollars that we have either received or expect to receive in the future from HUD. And then of course that $2 trillion package and the potential for additional support for evictions, for affordable housing and other areas, childcare. It was a pretty comprehensive package.
Yeah, I'm not doubting our response locally, because I think we have, especially with the support of CARE Act funding. I just think about these modeling forecasts that look at national and then they try to hone down into the local, and none of it really resonates in the way that I think about workers. I never really shows in a tangible way how it's affecting our population in different wage sectors. So that's something that I'm interested in. The other thing that I was curious about, you said that with this economic growth happening, there'll be improving housing inventories. So how did you project that? Because right now our new inventory is very limited and financially out of reach for a lot of people. So I'm just curious how you got to that.
Right. And thank you so much. That's a great question, Councillor Villarreal. So if we study the sort of the real estate data, one response that many people had in regards to the pandemic is that it changed the way that it changed our mobility a little bit in many different dimensions. So on one hand, the very high end of the spectrum, people were considering buying second homes and other things. And on the other end, people were often concerned. They were often trapped. They felt in a way that they couldn't, they didn't feel comfortable putting their homes up for sale. And we see a sharp drop in inventories during the pandemic. And some of that is attributed to concerns about the pandemic itself. And so as we approach forward and look sort of at the long range trend in housing inventories and other things, we expect that will increase. But I'm grateful for your question, because one of the other things is will this result in greater affordability? And it would take a drastic increase in housing inventories to have an effect on that level. We expect that, for instance, in the United States as a whole, in 2020, the price of real estate increased on average about 10%. Over the long run, if we go back 20 years, 30 years, a traditional rate, 4 to 5% is a typical year-to-year increase in real estate levels. So the rate of increase is the highest that we've seen. And it's been higher than that here even in Santa Fe. And as long as rates remain low, that's likely to continue. When we look at these things going forward, we expect an uptick in mortgage rates towards the end of the year. And again, those really low price mortgages are helping fuel a lot of that increase. But it doesn't seem like there's any way to let that up. It's an unsustainable rate of increase, but as a famous finance professor, Campbell Harvey, said, bubbles can be short lasting or long lasting. And there's nothing to say that it will correct itself anytime soon. And there's nothing in the data to suggest that there'll be a decrease in real estate prices, even with added inventories in the short run anyway. And so that's sort of where we're looking right now.
So to follow up, do you see our inventories increasing?
I think as the, yes, oh, I'm sorry. Goodness, it's the delay is, I'm sorry. Yes, the inventories this year should increase accordingly, but I think that highly depends on the level of reopening with the pandemic. Consumer behavior is tricky like that because we know that a lot of people, they might have the money, they might have been saving to go out and buy a house, and inventories and people have to show a willingness to move. But inventories across the country have been quite low, incidentally, in a lot of places. Where that is different, if you look at different cities, for instance, we do have some cities across the country that showed more people were moving out than moving in. An example is San Francisco. The city of San Francisco itself saw people moving out, moving to other parts of the Bay Area, though, rather than leaving the state of California in aggregate. And those type of local effects are likely to continue too.
Thank you for the information, additional information. That's all, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Councilwoman Cassette Sanchez.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to piggyback a little bit on what Councilwoman Villarreal was discussing about how the pandemic has impacted different populations differently. Specifically, there's been a lot of discussion nationally about women leaving the workforce to take care of children. And one of the issues that I think is probably not unique to Santa Fe, but I know a really big challenge in Santa Fe, is the scarcity of childcare and a lot of women not being able to enter back into the workforce due to the fact that childcare centers are still operating at lower levels, as well as many of them have closed. And I'm curious how we are potentially able to look at how that is impacting the Santa Fe economy and our recovery for workers, especially since you mentioned that really what we're looking at is people that are looking for work. But how are we able to really see how this might have impacted our residents who are not looking for work because of this?
That's a very good question, Councilor Cassette Sanchez. I'm so grateful that you brought this to the attention too. And you're absolutely right. The closures of childcare services and schools and other places and other things probably did have an effect where women were disproportionately hit in these circumstances. And consequently, this is an obstacle that we've seen for economic recovery. And the problem is the data that we look at. So for instance, even though the economy is doing really well and we're seeing a lot more people employed in the marketplace, we still have a participation rate across the country, which is about 61.5%. As a context, that's roughly 2% lower than where we were prior to the pandemic. And that's millions of people. That's about, and to give you a sense of that, that's about 3 to 4 million people that have dropped out of the labor force for one reason or another. And it's difficult to extrapolate that locally. If we were to take that down a notch and say, well, if New Mexico represents roughly, 150th of the labor force of the country, we can extract some real numbers. We can provide a cost estimate to that, but it is probably significant. The hope is that, or the modeling that takes into context shows a gradual ramp up of participation. As schools become available, as childcare becomes more available, we anticipate greater participation in the labor force, and that in return will be demonstrated in our economic projections in fiscal year 2022 through fiscal year 2023. But again, that highly depends on the pandemic too. There are openings, there are other things as well. And obviously public health is a primary concern, but it does have real effects. So The data at the local level, I don't have regarding the number of childcare institutions that might be available and the amount of closure. I'm speaking as a parent of a 7-year-old here in Santa Fe that I know has 2 working parents that work for it. It's something that hits close to home, and it's caused a lot of adjustments that we've had to do. And I'm fortunate that I have a job where I can at least work from home as well. So I understand profoundly those concerns as well. And so we need a little bit more data on it, and some of it isn't available yet.
Thank you. Yeah, that's something that I would like to, see how we can keep an eye on it. Which leads me to some of my other questions regarding some of the changes in the pandemic. And there've been a lot of positive things, but a couple things recently that have concerned me. One is the variant and how it is affecting children under 16 in Michigan, especially since this is a population that we currently do not have a vaccine approved for. And the second is the CDC pausing the Johnson & Johnson vaccination rollout due to some very rare but serious complications. And I'm curious how we will, I'm assuming, obviously the Johnson & Johnson announcement was today. Have you had any time to look at these variants and how those might be impacting things, as well as how we might be able to project how these 2 components may impact Santa Fe's economic recovery?
Mr. Chair, Counselor, I'll go ahead and take a first stab at this. I think, first and foremost, the revenue, which is the next section of the presentation, the revenue estimates and the forecast for FY22, do not factor in the most optimistic scenario. Dr. White did review, economic modeling with you, econometric modeling with you briefly, and all the different components and variables that have been factored into that economic outlook, which we then took and then used as a basis for our revenue forecasting. So that being said, it's what we have pertaining to the FY22 budget in front of us is, again, not the most optimistic scenario, but we still understand that this is a downside risk, exactly what you described, Counselor, that could potentially impact us as we move forward. And that's why I also included and mentioned at the beginning of this presentation that the budget is a plan. As we have demonstrated over the last few years, anytime we have better than expected revenues or revenues are expected to shrink, we do bring forward budget adjustments. That is part of the 2-week process as council meets every 2 weeks that we are afforded with this calendar that we have for the city of Santa Fe's governing body meetings. So as any of that does play into or start to impact any of our revenues more for the city of Santa Fe closer to home, as any of those trends may play out into the next fiscal year, we do have a plan to be able to adjust for that. And Dr. White, do you want to briefly just address some of the question that Councilor Casaway-Sanchez asked?
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Finance Director McCoy. I'm so grateful. Yes, those, and I want to reiterate that in our economic models, we always anticipate sort of a worst case scenario at all times. I think it's important, and that worst case scenario is additional pandemic restrictions and additional pandemic effects on the labor force and the economy. And also it's that fine balance of modeling both. We want to be right as close to Ken as we possibly can be. And right now, a combination. So you brought up J&J as a good example of this. If we factored into, one of the things I examined was the sort of the vaccine take-up rate across the population, or the vaccine rate across the US population, as well as New Mexico. And both New Mexico and the US have exceeded my mid-case projection for vaccinations so far. And so to kind of reiterate that, the projections are on the conservative side, we're looking at a situation where we have already exceeded the expectations of where I'd initially thought the vaccine would be in April, back in February. But that trajectory needs to continue. And I think that with regards to this, you also have consumer behavior. Even during the worst parts of the pandemic, we had a certain percentage of population doing things, spending money in other ways and making things happen. And the way that money gets spent gets distributed. And often we've seen that when people respond to closures, they'll shift from an in-person experience to a digital experience or something of that sort. And it shifts where the revenues come from. But often a lot of the baseline revenues are still there. And that was one of the key points we wanted to address too. So it's factored in, it's considered in these models, and it's within so far the boundary of what our expectation is.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for that, that explanation, that answer. I do appreciate the caution, as although things are looking better, I really do appreciate you taking into consideration, and Mary, you putting forward a budget proposal that is, that does make sure that we are not going to be in a situation where we overspend and then get in, another hit and things are not looking so great. So thank you both so much. I have no further questions at this time.
Okay, Councilor Rivera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted just to ask Mary briefly, I'm not on the finance committee, so who is Dr. White?
Mr. Chair, Councilor, thank you for that question. Dr. Riley White is by training, has had extensive experience in macroeconomic forecasting and revenue forecasting. He is currently has his own business, but also a professor, a tenured professor at the University of New Mexico. We have contracted with him in the current year to provide us with additional information and assistance, and to conduct our economic and portion of our revenue forecasting for updates for the current year, as well as updates for fiscal year 22 and out years as well. I think this is, given the lessons learned about how complicated the economic recession and the pandemic caused by the pandemic has been, is extremely challenging for everyone in the United States to wrap our minds around changing consumer behavior, changing our patterns of travel. So to be able to have someone focused on this, the finance department did contract with Dr. White to provide this additional assistance and expertise as we move forward through our economic recovery period and the post-pandemic period.
So your feeling is we didn't have this expertise in-house?
Mr. Chair, Councilor Rivera, this is one of the positions that we have kept vacant due to the shortfall in budget, but we do place a high value in having this particular skill set to be able to guide us through these series of years when we are all facing these unprecedented times.
Do you know if any other finance directors have hired somebody to help with the budget as Dr. White?
Mr. Chair, if I may, the city of Albuquerque has a full-time.
Mr. Chair, I don't know. Mr. Chair, I don't know who's speaking.
Sorry, that's Bradley Fletch. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. Councilor Rivera, the city of Albuquerque has a full-time hired economist that does a lot of the work that Dr. White has done, but they also produce, 5-year forecasts. They work with UNM, Bureau of Business and Economic Research. Had to get that one right. So yes, if bigger communities would contract, or if they're big enough, have this on staff. As you know, the state of New Mexico has, probably 30 economists in various different agencies that do this work that Dr. White has done for the city.
Mr. Chair, Councilor, the Bieber organization with UNM we also subscribe to receive their economic information and updates as well, to be able to provide additional insight to what we are experiencing and what our projected forecasts are. Again, as Bradley mentioned, we've been fortunate in our previous Treasury officer position that that particular person came from the state and worked in that economic forecasting role for the state. So I think it's been filled by different expertise in the city at different times, but I'm again very grateful, given the shortfalls that we've experienced, to be able to have this outside expertise to be able to provide the additional information.
I get it, but the question was, have we ever hired anybody like Dr. White to help with the budget?
Mr. Chair, Councilor Rivera, we can go ahead and look into previous year's contracts, but I do not believe we have ever hired someone in this particular capacity to help us with this level of detailed econometric modeling before.
All right, Ms. McCoy, how long is this contract for?
Mr. Chair, Councilor, the contract, we would like the contract to continue through next fiscal year. The current contractual agreement that we have is through the end of the fiscal year, but we have included it as part of our budget recommendation for next year.
And how much is it for per year?
Mr. Chair, Councilor, I believe it is, I will defer to Bradley Flitch for the exact amount.
Mr. Chair, Councilor Rivera, FY21 contract is for $20,000.
And then for next fiscal year?
My guess it will be
the same.
It will be the same?
Mr. Chair, Councilor, that is what we have included in our FY22 budget, yes.
All right, so clearly we need the expertise of Dr. White, and we've put him on contract. Who approved this contract?
Mr. Chair, Councilor, this was done through a purchase order.
All right, so it wasn't signed by the city manager?
The contract is under 60,000. So Brad, did we have a contractual agreement that was signed by the city manager?
Under the procurement rules of or Mr. Chair, Councilor Rivera, under the procurement rules of a small purchase was best available price. And so it was procured that this professional service was procured that way.
What do you mean best available price?
Meaning that no bids required.
Well, then how do you know he was the best available price?
Well, no, I mean, it's.
Mr. Chair, Councilor, under our procurement code, if we enter into a purchase order from 20,000 or under, that is considered the best obtainable price. So we could potentially receive anyone who is engaging in a purchase order for 20,000 and under, according to the state procurement code, can procure services with the assurance that that is the best obtainable price. Anything from 20 to 60,000, you do need 3 quotes. Anything over 60,000, you would have to engage in a bid or an RFP process.
And is this something the city manager would have to sign off on?
Mr. Chair, Councilor, at this lower dollar level under the threshold of a small purchase order is something that we can have our chief procurement officer approve. That does not require a contractual services agreement that our city manager would sign off on.
All right, so this is the first time I've heard of the name of the contract of anything else. So little rough way to start the budget meetings, but you know, we'll just move forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you, Councilor Rivera. I'll just add that as the chair of finance, the finance committee has been aware of Mr. White and the finance department wanting to contract in this way, and we were okay with it, given the fact that we are in a pandemic and dealing with a financial situation that we've never, quite frankly, have never dealt with before, not just as a city, but as a community and a country. And so I know as far as the finance committee go and being the chair of the finance, we've actually appreciated having Dr. White on board to help us through this time, because what I didn't want, especially as the chair of finance, is I didn't want getting the opposite from members of the governing body as well. How do we know what you're saying is correct? How do we know that what you're projecting is going to be? And so I think given what we're dealing with, as like I said, in our current economic situation as a country and as a city, I myself as the chair, and I know other members of the finance committee, appreciated the foresight that the finance department had, bringing Dr. White on board to help us as we move forward in these uncertain times. Councilwoman Vihil-Coppler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I didn't have this comment, but I'll have it now. And I think what the issue is that communication goes a long way. And for those not on the Finance Committee, it is, I think these are valid questions. And unfortunately, maybe they have to be asked here. But if we had been informed, or, and especially had opportunity to ask questions in another type of forum, it wouldn't, I think it's a little bit sensitive right now, but it's always good to communicate what's going on. And so I can appreciate the questions that Councillor Rivera has, because they might be the same kind of questions I have. Now, this isn't to say that the information isn't helpful. It is helpful. And I hope that sometime we can develop the expertise and qualifications on staff so that we can always have this kind of information rather than play catch up. But nevertheless, it is what it is. And with regard to the information, I wanted to follow back up on Councillor Villarreal's question and comment about housing and its effect on underrepresented groups. And with my experience in real estate, I will say that I agree that inventory after, now that we're coming out of the pandemic, is going to grow. Housing prices, though, will not be coming down. They won't be getting more affordable. And it speaks to Councillor Villarreal's question, because what we had in Santa Fe, and it is all local, real estate is local, once affordable homes, once affordable neighborhoods are now really no longer affordable. And I can speak to that because the prices in Del Bellama, for instance, where we've seen many families purchase homes and grow their families, those are going into the $300,000 and $400,000 price range in Del Bellama. In Terra Contenta, many of those homes are going into the $300,000. I've seen some $400,000 homes in Terra Contenta. And so while inventory may grow, every seller is looking to make some money when they sell. So the prices aren't going to be going down. And I think that definitely affects underrepresented groups with regard to housing. And right now, we really don't have any single family homes in the $200,000 range. And practically anything that's available there are condos, maybe 1 bedroom, maybe 2 bedroom. And so while this isn't necessarily different than what's been stated by this presentation, I think it does bring up that it's not really as rosy a picture, because it is going to exacerbate more of our affordable housing issues and more of the reason why we need stick-built homes rather than, in addition to funding the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, because sooner than later, the Affordable Housing Trust Fund is going to be providing funds to continue the high-priced inventory, whether it's rental or regular family-owned homes. So I just wanted to make that point, because I think it needed to be made, especially because real estate is local. And that's where we are right now in Santa Fe. So thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Okay, Ms. McCoy, so let's go ahead and move on to the recommended budget revenue forecast, and then we'll get into the Community Development Department budget.
Thank you. For this section, we're going to have Bradley Flitch review this with us.
Good afternoon, Chairman Abeyta, councilors. Next slide, please. What we're trying to do in this next section is translate Dr. White's economic analysis into the actual revenue of the city. So the first thing is we need to understand there are 2 primary sources of revenue to the city. And this represents roughly 75% of the city's total revenue. And that's taxes and fee for service, or fees and service. Taxes are property tax, GRT, lodger's tax, franchise fee, gas tax, and there's a couple others. And then under services, it's primarily the water, wastewater, and environmental services utilities. And GRT by itself is 1/3 of all city revenues by itself. And so when you think about Dr. White's presentation and the $5 trillion in stimulus and the pent-up demand and the increase in the savings rate, 1/3 of all GRT is derived from retail trade. We've been reporting, the finance staff has been reporting to the council monthly, the various industry sectors that produce our GRT revenues. So 1/3 of all GRT revenues comes from retail trade. When you think about the industries that, make up, 65% of all, there's 4 industries that make up 65% of all GRT paid to the city: retail trade, construction, professional services, technical, and accommodations and food service. So that's why it's important to understand the information that Dr. White was providing us, is because these are all sectors that are generating the revenue. So when you look at just accommodation and retail trade, that's 40% of all GRT. Next slide, please. This is the month by month. As you look at where GRT is, February is the lowest month of the year. And so we should be reporting on that here in a couple of weeks. FY20 was the best year in GRT the city ever had, just over 115 million. Mainly, you can see in July of 2020, we received 3.7 million, sort of a one-time settlement that TRD had negotiated with a class of taxpayers. And so that singular month put us well over and into the over 115 million in revenue from GRT. So, staff, as you can look at the lines compared to the bars, the blue line at the bottom was the FY21 original budget. And the red line just above that is either actual GRT revenue or our revised projections. I believe that from February forward, they're all revised projections. And so we've kept the council informed, and we've made adjustments to the budget as the real-time data came in. And that's what we had promised the finance committee and the governing body we would do throughout the year. So next slide, please. This here is the second largest source of revenue, and the fees and service. And this here, I've just eliminated everything except for water, wastewater, and environmental services. And again, much like the previous chart, the bars represent the previous actual revenues by month. The orange line is the actual FY21, where we are on month, and then the FY22 budget. So, and that's one of the reasons why the utilities were allowed to do a significant bar at the beginning of the year is when you look at their, that it's just stable. And even though that we've had a huge increase in number of units, you would think with 2,000 new apartment units and other things that you would see a pickup in revenues, both water, wastewater, and environmental services. They've all been very consistent year over year. Next slide, please. This is property tax over the past. We're expecting property tax to be flat for FY21 and a small increase in FY22. One of the reasons property tax has been flat, even though over the from tax year 2017, the total appraised taxable value in the city was $4.034 billion. It has grown to $4.5 billion, or it's grown just about $500 million in the past 4 years. And with that growth and refunding of the 2010 GO bond and the growth in property tax, while the operating mill rate stayed the same, the debt service mill rate in tax year 2017 was 0.79 mils. In tax year FY20, the debt service mill rate had fallen to 0.35 mils, or the debt service fell more than half for the city. Now, when you look at that from a city's collection point of view, property owners in Santa Fe did not have to pay that additional debt service. The difference between tax year 2020 and 2017, that's 1.6 million in just for 20 though, is 1.6 million the city didn't collect because the debt service mill rate had declined. Next slide, please. And the last major tax is lodger's tax. And when you look back to the monthly reports on GRT, accommodation and food service in FY or prior to the pandemic represented roughly 15% of all GRT paid. And right now, it bounces between 15 and 18% of total GRT, depending on the month. Right now, it's fallen to under 10%. It's in the single digits. Why is this important, and why are Dr. White's economic forecast of travel and accommodations and use? We have a lot of room to grow and in collections on lodger's tax. So we have, that's where a significant portion of the city's revenue comes from. And those lodger's tax also, when you have lodger's tax, you're also collecting GRT on those visitors. We are forecasting that FY21, we've revised it downward, even though the first half of the year collections were a little better than we expected. We had budgeted 25% of the prior year. It came in about 33% of the prior year. But then the second half, we had it budgeted at 75% of the prior year. And so we just don't see that we're going to be hitting that high level of accommodations. And also collections has been an issue. The council will be looking at the lodger's tax amendments tomorrow, I believe. And there is in the FIR, a position within the Treasury Division specifically for lodger's tax administration and collection. And so it may not be that the 21 gets it. We may actually collect it in 22. But right now it is, we're reducing the budget. And next slide. And with that, I'll stand for questions on revenues. And just to mention also, we covered the main ones. We are, as the facilities open up, we are going to be seeing a pickup in, recreational fees. We're going to be seeing an increase in parking fees as the economy picks up. But really, we wanted to address the major big ticket items: lodger's tax, property tax, GRT, and utility revenue. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Councilwoman Romero Worth. You're on mute, Councilwoman.
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be quick. I know we're running a little bit behind. Last year, I think you forecasted that it would take, I don't know, longer than it took us to recover from the 2008 recession, to recover from the dive in our pandemic revenues. I'm just wondering if you are forecasting, what you're forecasting and maybe how it's changed. And how you're feeling. Again, this is an opportunity to talk about, we're not quite through the pandemic yet, but what's our sense of certainty with where we are.
Mr. Chair, Councilor, thank you for that question. I think last year when we were putting together multiple iterations of the FY21 revenue estimates and the expenditure budget, we had several different changing factors. I think something that Dr. White did touch on was the fact that the $5 trillion stimulus in kind of 3 different chunks that the federal government has put forward over the last year has really been a boost to our economy. This was, pretty much unexpected, this level of investment, completely unprecedented in our nation's history, that we have this level of federal stimulus. So I think that has been a positive to be able to shorten that timeline for recovery. That being said, I think, as you alluded to, we are still not in the clear. For FY21, we did see, revised, if I can just take GRT, revised estimates that we put forward in March from 90 million to 97 million based on where we were at in the red, yellow, green, turquoise improvements and loosening our local restrictions and our vaccination rates. But at this time, even looking into FY22 with that increase in GRT from the 97 million to the 109 million, we are still not at pre-pandemic levels in just that one particular revenue source. But you saw that in the lodger's tax chart that Brad shared with you as well, that, that all-time high for lodger's tax was 12.5 million right before the pandemic, the fiscal year before the pandemic. So both on the expenditure side as well as the revenue side, we have not quite reached the pre-pandemic levels yet. But again, we do have additional federal stimulus programs to look forward to coming down the pipeline. So again, if for some reason, we talked about the downside risk earlier, that there's, an increase in a new variant or an increase in transmission, or the vaccination rates don't keep up the same pace, and that negatively impacts our revenue, we have the ability to decrease the budget downward. Same goes on the opposite side. If there is a particular package that stimulates our economy from the federal government, we would be able to add in, additional GRT or, both on the expense side and on the revenue side, additional budget through those quarterly budget adjustments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's all I have.
Okay, Councilwoman Cassette Sanchez.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I did have some technical difficulty, so I apologize if this was touched on while I was being booted off. I'm curious if we have looked at what our projections might be for revenue with the legalization of recreational marijuana and how that might impact our revenues this fiscal year.
Mr. Chair, Councilor, we have yet to start that process. We are looking forward to that process, given that the governor has recently signed that bill into law. At this time, we do not anticipate seeing any revenues in FY22 for that here locally. So one of the areas where we are going to be a beneficiary of changes to state laws, actually with the local sales tax, internet sales tax. So that will go fully into effect in FY22 and has been accounted for in our estimates as well. And the good news about that is due to the change in behavior for ordering, purchasing at retail from bricks and mortar to online, if that behavioral trend maintains through the next fiscal year, we will be the beneficiaries of an additional spike in GRT for that change. So it is important to understand how our state laws do impact our local revenue sources, but not in the short term for legalization of marijuana and our potential impacts, but yes to internet sales tax.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Director McCoy.
Okay, Mayor Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't want to let Bradley's presentation go past without noting something that I think is a significant but often overlooked financial piece of work that Bradley and Director McCoy have been able to do, and that has to do with managing debt service. The prior presentation I was listening to the committee talk about impact of housing costs on individual families and on working families. One thing we can have a positive impact on is property taxes. Property taxes are a regressive tax. It really doesn't have anything to do with your earning power. It simply is based on the valuation of your property. And what I heard Bradley say, and it's worth maybe saying it again in simple layman's terms, is that by the way in which our finance department managed our debt service, we effectively gave everybody a property tax cut. Now, it ended up reducing our revenue, which we have to reckon with, but in the period of time that it happened, it couldn't have been more timely because we were looking at folks dealing with reduced earning power, with more stress, with COVID-related financial setbacks. And for our team to have done such a terrific job of managing debt service that it effectively reduced the property tax load on people, regardless of their ability to pay, who had to step up and deal with property taxes, it's a very, very constructive thing to have done. And it got glossed over a little quickly and a little technically, but my understanding is that in effect, that's what Bradley was saying about our shift in property tax. It may be a property tax revenue loss, but it was a property tax cut to the residents of Santa Fe. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Councilwoman Vihel-Coppler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to ask about, you may be getting to this, but I didn't really see it. And that is, does this budget take into account paying back the reserves that we made up or took last year? I think it was like 14 million. Maybe it ended up being more, I'm not sure, but where do we account for that?
Mr. Chair, Councilor, in the FY21 budget that Council approved, we did factor in the use of reserves to the tune of 22.4 million. That being said, we intend to rebuild reserves. We do not intend to pay back those particular funds. I think it's an important concept, especially during the time of a recession. During the good years, we are able to plan, whether it's through the previous conversation about refinancing debt and having good proactive debt policy that has a positive impact on our property taxes, or being able to build up reserves for use in the time when we do see a revenue reduction, as we've seen over the course of the last year. That being said, this next budget does use approximately 10 million in reserves again, moving forward, as many communities have done throughout the United States and even here locally in New Mexico. And there was guidance put forward by the Department of Finance and Administration last year around this time, saying that they actually, just point of information, the Department of Finance and Administration requires an 8% general fund reserve level. The City of Santa Fe's City Council requires a 10% general fund reserve requirement. We have met, every single year, we have met that 10% general fund reserve requirement, even in the current fiscal year with the reductions. That is a fiscally prudent thing to do. That is something that our investors, the rating agencies, look for to be able to see how an organization is managing debt. That being said, last year at this time, the Department of Finance and Administration, which monitors the use of that, or the compliance with the 8% requirement at the state level for local governments, actually, for the first time, to my knowledge, relaxed that requirement for local governments and said, if you need to dip into your general fund reserve and dip below that 8% reserve requirement, it was okay. So that was just another indication of the severe magnitude of the recession and the economic conditions that all communities in New Mexico were facing. And again, I've been in contact with my counterparts in other local governments that have taken the same approach to, as we did last year and as we are in the coming year. So I think that's an important, note in order to prevent our services from declining even further. The use of reserves that we have built up in the good years is extremely prudent fiscal policy.
Thank you. I do know that when we were talking about the furloughs and we passed a budget that was estimated to continue to have a shortfall in it, but we did it anyway. There was a lot of talk about dipping into the $16 million shortfall and tapping into that by taking 14 million of that and putting it toward the budget. And now you're saying that we were always okay. I mean, is that what I'm hearing? Because I then it makes me wonder about the furloughs. Like, then why did we do that?
Mr. Chair, Councilor, for the FY21 revenue estimates, we did factor in $22.4 million into as revenue, as one-time revenue to support the level of expenses in our current fiscal year. That is, again, something, fiscal policy that we are able to use in a time when we do have an unanticipated decrease in our revenues.
So what do we have in reserves right now? And what percentage is that?
At this time, we have maintained the 10% reserve requirement in our general fund. This is, again, City of Santa Fe policy, as is written, I believe, in a resolution, that 10%. And not just every year, we have been able to maintain that over the course of the last 3 years.
And is this recommended budget maintaining that as well?
Mr. Chair, Councilor, yes, it is.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so Ms. McCoy, if you can go through expenditures briefly, we won't have, or I won't allow any questions regarding the rest of the presentation because the remaining of the budget is going to be all about expenditures. So there'll be plenty of time for questions as we go through each department and their specific expenditures. So let's go ahead and get through that. And then let's start with the Community Development Department budget.
Okay, the first slide in this section, I'm going to review just the overall all funds expenditure budget with you. For the recommended FY22 expenses, we are at $348.6 million. That's an increase of approximately 11.5%. We have divided this. This information is also included in the budget book for your review. We have reviewed this type of presentation with you previously. So there's approximately 36% of our expenditures are allocated to salaries and benefits, other significant investments throughout the year in contractual services, in debt service, both principal and interest, in other operating costs, and our insurance levels. So again, as the chair mentioned, we're going to be getting into this detail with each and every department. So I'm just going to flip to the next slide, which overviews the general fund expenses. At this point, we are at 105.9 million in general fund expenses. Our salaries and benefits in the general fund trend a little bit higher than across all of our funds at 69% of the 105 million, 106 million. And again, significant in investments in contracts and other operating costs in our insurance. Again, here, as was provided in the answers to the previous questions, the general fund reserves do meet the 10% mandate. Our City of Santa Fe 10% mandate is higher than the 8% required by the state. Next slide, please. This was also provided in the FY22 budget. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, we will be reviewing with you investments in our city employees, our neighborhoods, our community health and safety and recreation programs, community engagement, our park system, and investments in modernizing our city government. So that those are the areas of priority that we have selected to invest in during this economic recovery period. Next slide, please. The next series of slides, next slide, please, discuss the budget adjustment process. Again, this is something we have committed to. I believe the first budget adjustments that we brought forward in the current fiscal year were for the Public Utilities Department in the fall. So we will submit our budget to DFA in May of this year, and then we will continue to monitor both our revenues and our expenses throughout the duration of FY22. We have the good news to share that we are cautiously optimistic in our economic recovery, but as each quarter progresses, we will have the opportunity to bring forward budget adjustments, actually as frequently as every 2 weeks when the governing body meets. With that, Mr. Chairman, we can go ahead and move on to the next department's presentations.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, that'll bring us to the Community Development Department. The agenda lists economic development as the first division, then planning and land use, then affordable housing, arts and culture, and tourism. And the reason why I clarify that is because the information, the additional information that you sent to us via email, Ms. McCoy, doesn't follow that order, but we will follow that order on the agenda. So we're going to start with economic development.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee and the councilors, just want to make a short statement while she's setting up the slides because our other slides are by Alpha, and I can start economic development. But I want to just make an opening statement about community development, and I want to start by confirming that we are in agreement with the gist of the mayor's memo and Ms. McCoy's statement that the FY22 budget is an investment in our people, community, and quality of life. As you know, the Community Development Department was formed with the mission in mind, and over the past 9 months, we have adjusted to and addressed some of the big issues that have hindered us because of the effects of COVID. So in the department budgets you're going to hear, we hope to you see a sub-theme as we head into FY22 with a focus on resiliency, strategic planning, and capacity building. This fiscal year's budget framework will speak to stabilizing our business, cultural, community, and land use objectives, such as investment in business expansion, entrepreneurship, rebuilding social capital networks that the city is trying to do as we've been shut down for a while, growth management and strategic planning to inform land development, workforce, economic and cultural policy decisions for the future, and then lending support to jumpstart our tourism industry, and also creating a trust fund that can laser focus on our affordable housing needs. And what does this mean to your constituencies is a few things, I think. More economic and social stability as we stay the course at turquoise level and beyond. Strategic plans that will better inform how we bring well thought out ideas and initiatives that see us thrive in the next decade. And then filling out key roles that will increase our commitment to better customer engagement. And arts and culture programming that seeks to enrich us as the memory of COVID starts to fade away. and then forecasting of job opportunities and the creation of workforce development program. So each of our directors here will review their key budget priorities and answer any questions you may have. We're very proud of the work collectively that we've been done to get us through this pandemic year, but we're not out of the woods. But we're trying to be more entrepreneurial about how we prepare for the vision of what community development means long-term. So this fiscal year really is about that, what I said, resiliency, capacity building, and strategic planning. And then as we get to the long-term, we really sort of become more entrepreneurial about what community development means and what it will be for the future. And so with that, I'd like to just then start with economic development, if I could, Mary.
Okay, and then, yeah, what we will do, Mr. Brown, is you will present the economic development section, and then I will open it up for questions after you're done with your presentation. So we're not going to interrupt you during it. We will hold our questions.
We're done. Okay.
When you're,
thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, so some highlights from economic development are that as I think across the board, there's a 4% salary increase for non-union employees and a 3% salary increase for the director. I have to be the director of the Department of Economic Development and Community Development, but I'm not dipping in twice. But to support COVID and our economic recovery activities, one of the new things that I've done is added a new customer engagement business licensing role, a specialist that will be added to the team. We're trying to improve the customer engagement and use of the technology we have in the coming year. And so I'm slating one new person in the business licensing department to address that. Another one of our priorities is LEADA funding and grants. I have 7 business expansion opportunities coming into this new year. We're very excited about it as we talk about resiliency. And so some of the funding you'll see in the next slide is for that increased spending in LEADA grants and other consulting. On the other consulting side, I've set aside money for a strategic economic development plan. I've also set aside money to look at our broadband and telecom architecture and create a study for that. And then additionally, I've looked at, building some sponsorships for networking and entrepreneurial acceleration. We need new innovation in the city of Santa Fe if we want to diversify our economy. I think either Brad or Dr. White was saying that that tourism is the driver, and we need to be able to diversify this economy so that when times of this nature come again, that we have a balance there that we can address from that standpoint. So with that, I think the next slide would work. Hoping everyone can see it. First line, salary, wages, and benefits. I had spoke to the fact that we changed the added a new business licensing specialist, and this also reflects the increase in salaries for our non-union employees and directors. Next line in contracts and lab and utilities. This also is an increase of $179,000. That's for what I was talking about with LEADA investment, broadband investment, entrepreneurial investment. That increase is reflected there. The smaller issue supplies, insurance, and other operating costs, those were dropped down. We do have a new asset development person on board, so some of those costs are around how to prepare parcels ultimately to review in front of the city council if we bring them up for sale, marketing cost, et cetera. And the second portion of this slide really is how our funding is separated. We get some money from our general fund, 14%. I'm sorry, we get $948,000 from the general fund, and then from the economic development fund, we get 1.473. And I think that's it for economic development.
Okay, questions from the committee regarding economic development. Councilwoman Romero-Worth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Really quickly, the insurance line item I notice in a lot of these budgets is decreasing. Can somebody speak to what's happening there? Maybe Mary?
Mr. Chair, Councilor Romero, I'm going to ask someone from finance, maybe Bradley Fletch. Oops, he's on mute. Mary, you're on mute.
Mr. Chair, Councilor, thank you for that question. As you indicated, there are some decreases in certain insurance does incorporate a variety of different accounts. including, premiums that we pay for health insurance, as well as our, risk premiums. So depending on the types of positions that are included in the budget for FY22 or the risk premium assessment for that particular department, you could either see a decrease in that particular category or an increase.
But there isn't something that we're doing, because normally insurance goes up, not down. So just sort of curious why on a number of different budgets we're seeing it go down.
Okay, Mr. Chair, Councilor, I can go ahead and put together a briefing sheet on that to be able to explain that, since that is something that we're seeing across multiple different departments.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Councilwoman Villarreal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Director Brown, for the presentation. And just want to clarify, in the document that we received, it says position count, and it says no new position. So there's two questions I have. One is the customer engagement business licensing specialist. Is that an existing position that's now going to be filled?
That's correct.
Chair, Councilor.
Mr. Chair, Councilor Villarreal, I think Mary is going to speak to that, but that's correct.
Mr. Chair, Councilor, yes, that is correct.
Okay, so it's vacant, that was frozen, and now will be, there'll be somebody in place for that, hopefully soon.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think we definitely need that position. So we had talked about this in multiple committees, but about project management for Midtown.
Yes.
And the position that would be needed to support that, although we had talked about needing more than one person, but so where is that in here and why is that not listed as I don't think it was a new position. I think it was a vacancy you had as well. So where does that fit into here, into this budget?
Mr. Chair, Councilor Villarreal, the position vacancy is coming from another department and not yet economic development. We are still in discussions on how to technically move and create that role. So our current discussions are around taking an open rec that's in Public Works to fill that position instead of finding new funding. And then from there, working through the delegation aspects of whether that person reports directly to me or to the city manager as we move forward. So we're in sort of talks about that, but the funding would come from what we're looking for, hopefully from the Public Works Department. There's a project administrator role there that we want to take from there and fulfill that role. But the pointing to part is what we're still in discussion about, whether it comes through the community development or it does directly to the city manager.
Okay, but so
Chair, Councilor, just to clarify a point on that, that is that particular position is one of 5 new FTE and positions in Public Works that we'll go over with you tomorrow.
Yep, I realize that. I just want to make sure that it doesn't stay in Public Works because it's specific to Midtown, and Director Brown is the lead on that piece. And I know that Councilwoman Cassett Sanchez had the same question concerning that. And so I just want to make sure that that you're in control of that piece, because it's very important to be in unison with the project manager. So I'm hoping that that will fall under your department because will be somebody that you'll be working closely with. And then just to make sure, you said 7 business expansion opportunities for LIDA.
Yes.
Can you say a little bit more about that?
Mr. Chair, Councilor Villarreal, some I can't divulge yet. I can kind of give you sort of a general idea. So 2 of them are in the manufacturing area, food manufacturing area, and 5 of them are from the technology side. What's exciting is that a couple of them are coming through our incubation program. So that's generally what I could share with you, and then we'll make it our way through the Economic Development Advisory Committee when we have data, term sheets, et cetera, applications filled out to make it more public. But it's a very exciting move, and one of them especially is possibly moving into one of our opportunity zones. So we would have opportunities for jobs where it's walkability. You could actually, hire folks who could walk to work. So we're very excited about some of that.
Thank you. And that's essentially supporting LEDA. It's not a one-to-one match, but it's matching state funds or not necessarily?
Mr. Chair, Council Villarreal, it's mostly matching state funds. Usually the state provides a larger tranche of money than we do. And we kind of, average around 50,000 over 10 years. But it depends upon the size of the expansion that's going forward.
Got it. So what was the total amount for the business expansion opportunities?
Give me 1 second. Let me see if I have that document. We're looking at about $140,000 for new business expansion.
Okay, thank you. And then the strategic economic plan, I'm assuming that's a contractor, and broadband study, that's a contractor. What's the amount for those two contracts?
Mr. Chair, Council Villarreal, for the strategic economic plan, I'm estimating about $150,000. And it's usually like a 1 year, it's a 1 year project to get all the data research and et cetera. And then for the broadband, we are looking at sort of architecture, working with the county also. And I'm estimating that around $100,000, which will sort of help us understand the architecture of the city. One of our issues we have with broadband and internet service even just fiber is that we're a very old city and we can't really put a lot of things under the ground because of architecture, archaeology. So we have to sort of figure out how to create a map that will work for us. And that has not been done. So we're working with the county and city, and I want to get involved in that so that we can help for the future. Separately, we are also funding, right now we're funding the public Wi-Fi project. That's still going on separately from this internet broadband piece. And then I'm hopeful that the federal art funds could be used to supplement some of that as I expand into other zip codes of the city.
Got it, thank you. And then you said one more thing, business sponsorship. I missed the rest of what you said.
Yeah, business for entrepreneurship. So business sponsorship. So working with the county, working with the chambers, working with the angel groups, working with funders, sponsoring events. I talked about creating business social capital. We've been kind of shut in, so you kind of lose your contacts. And we need that sort of vibrancy as the city starts to grow and ideas start to percolate. So we would invest money in sponsoring events and sponsoring programs that others are doing to spur and stimulate connections and networking, and then hopefully some innovation and entrepreneurship.
Got it. And what's the amount for that budgeted?
For that, I have about, let's see, what did I put in there? $85,000 over the fiscal year.
Got it. Okay. And then just to follow back on the possibility of land sales, does this budget consider potential land sales for this fiscal year?
That's a good question, Councilor Villarreal. It considers we may have land sales, but it's just a small, I think I have like $20,000 in the asset development department for marketing to maintain our website, to get materials together, because with the new resolution, we have to come forward to the city council if we have a parcel of land or lease that needs to be approved for public notice of sale.
Okay, and then the actual sales revenue, is that part of your budget?
Mr. Chair, Council Villarreal, it's not necessarily true because some of our land parcels are pointed to different departments. So currently, Las Estrellas, Santa Fe Estates is not pointed, used to be pointed to economic development. It's now completely pointed to the general fund. Another example is the Northwest Quadrant lands, that is pointed to economic development. But other parcels, smaller parcels of land are separated in different ways. Another example is the rail yard. Land parcels of the rail yard are actually pointed to a rail yard enterprise fund and not to economic development. So what here is expenses. And so we are actually expending money to potentially make those sales happen through our asset development manager.
Got it. Thank you. That's all, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Councilwoman Cassette Sanchez.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Real fast, can we go to the previous slide? I just want to make sure that I'm understanding. This is probably a question for Director McCoy. understanding the position count charts and exactly what we're looking at with those. So are all of these positions, for example, the positions listed in FY21, there's 11 positions. Does this include any positions that we would have frozen last year as well? Although not, I understand specifically for each department it will change, but in general.
Mr. Chair, Councilor, thank you for your question. In looking at this particular fund table for the Community Development Fund for the Economic Development Department, I think it might be a good opportunity. We're going to be using these position count tables in all of the different departments. So I would like to just give you an overview first. So we've included the department name and what the FY21 position count was and what the total position count for the department is in FY22. In some cases, there have been changes from FY21 to FY22. In the cases we'll see with a few of the other departments in community development, we actually went in and added positions or potentially transferred positions in other departments, like in community services. So that being said, when we did add a position, that would be reflected in the column that says number of new positions. And then the changes from FY21 to 22, whether it was a transfer or adding a new position, will be detailed in that column. So to answer your question, the FY22 recommended includes all position counts, including new positions, including frozen positions, including positions where we have included the funding to fill those positions in FY22. So all positions.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. So then for this particular, and I will be asking this for all of them, for this particular position count, are all 11 positions funded and unfrozen and ready to fill if they're not already?
Mr. Chair, Councilor Casavit-Sanchez, no, not all of the positions. Rarely because we are not yet at pre-pandemic levels, rarely does a department include full funding for all positions. Even in a normal budget year, usually there's a few positions that remain unfunded due to department priorities. We have also taken a low vacancy rate for the majority of the departments throughout next fiscal year. So I'm pulling up the information, or maybe someone from our staff can give you the specific number of positions that will be filled next year. I'm pulling that up right now. We have 10 positions in economic development that are funded and to be filled next fiscal year, and only one that remains vacant and unfunded, which is essentially frozen.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. I really appreciate you providing that information. I did want to circle back on the discussion that Councilwoman Villarreal started regarding the project manager position that would be the Midtown project manager. As Councilwoman Villarreal alluded to, I'd spoken to her earlier today and then had an opportunity to speak with Director Brown a bit more. The first thing that I'm in agreement with Councilwoman Villarreal that I would like to see this position report to Director Brown, because you are the lead on Midtown. And I also feel that in terms of what I'm understanding this position to currently be, and it is a permanent position, so it will exist ostensibly after Midtown, what we potentially see it as the future, that it really is something that belongs in the Community Development Department. So Rich, can you describe a little bit about the job description, the vision for this position, both now, during Midtown, and then what it would be potentially after Midtown?
Mr. Chair, Councilor Casas-Sanchez, thank you for the question. Yes, for the Midtown project manager, their role is something that we had originally asked our developer to fill, but what they primarily will do is they're the zoning applicant for the city as we zone from R5 to C2. They also become sort of an infrastructure and planning, local infrastructure and planning coordinator at the Midtown campus, working very closely with the property manager that's there, Sam Burnett. And so that is not a 1 day, 1 month, 6 month role, and the zoning will take first priority, and then the sort of the infrastructure work, the access work, working with our asset development team on land swaps and the early development ideas and potential short-term leases will be a part of their sort of portfolio of work that need to do. And as I foresee it in the future is that once we are in a master planning mode with Midtown and solicitations are done for development of housing, commercial, et cetera, this role could morph into a more of a community development role where they are the conduit between public development, land development, and the city's goals. So if you look around at other cities, they have sort of their own offshoot community development organizations that have kind of a liaison between what's happening public development wise and land development wise for the community and its goals. As I spoke earlier to you, we talked about the fact that Santa Fe has an opportunity to not only leverage the opportunity zone locations, but we also have these potential innovation villages that will run down Cerrillos from downtown to just beyond the Presbyterian Hospital. So as those opportunities come to fore, this person could be a conduit to make sure that the city's goals match into what this public development is all about from that standpoint. So they'll take on, making sure that the ducks are in a row and that as we envision through Mr. Isaacson's growth management plan, that's where in economic development and community development, that person would play that part.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for highlighting that. And as I mentioned to you earlier, if Midtown's not community development, I'm not entirely sure what is. So I really do think that this project manager should move. I'm not sure what the logistics are, and maybe Ms. McCoy can speak to this a little bit, considering that the funding source, I believe, came from a vacancy in Public Works and is part of a package of a number of other Public Works project managers, but it does seem that this one has a different job description, a different vision than the other project managers in Public Works. I know that we'll get into more detail on that tomorrow, but am I interpreting that correctly?
Mr. Chair, Councilor Casowitz Sanchez, the one additional project manager position that has been slated for Midtown is funded in the Public Works Department with general fund and is part of 5 additional FTEs that have been added to the Public Works Administration budget. So in the event that we would, trying to think of a good example, last year there was conversation that ensued around the public defender position and the appropriate department placement for the public defender position. And it was decided to transfer the position and the salary for that public defender position from community services into community engagement. And so that we are able to transfer the position as well as the funding associated with that position. If deemed appropriate, we can do it through the budget process now in these 2 weeks or at a later date.
And then what is the salary? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Councilor, I just want to also add that that we are still in debate about where it points, and there is no real reason either way. It could still point to me and my department or to the city manager. So we can come to an agreement on that, I think, in our future discussions. But there is no, as long as it's not pointing to the land use department or is reporting to land use, it's still either way. It's just a matter of they need that autonomy to be able to come to the council for policy decisions. And so whether they report to me or to the city manager, we can work through that over the next weeks. But we found the funding. And then we just need to figure out the technical play of reporting structure.
Wonderful, thank you. And I do suppose that we can have that kind of pros and cons. I do know that there are some factors where it might be better with the city manager, but also being in a department kind of builds an individual into the infrastructure a little bit more of the city and its functioning. So I do look forward to more of that conversation. I'm not sure how it impacts us approving the budget here today.
Yeah, Councilwoman Casette Sanchez, I would prefer that we let our position or our opinion or our position be known, but I think when it comes to actually deciding where positions belong, I think that's something that should probably be decided by the entire council, maybe when we approve the budget or at a later date. But I certainly think we could make our initial fillings and positions be made during our finance committee budget hearings. But again, I don't want to make a specific recommendation without the entire governing body being present and being able to discuss it along with the mayor and the manager.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for helping me out with that process piece. I don't believe I have any other questions on this right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, Councilor Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just got a quick question, and I think this might be one that I don't remember if we asked it last year. But in regards to the budget, and Rich, if we can go to the next slide, please. And so with this, what I would consider this is a very high level overview of a budget. And as a governing body, we'll be charged with approving the budget. And I want to make sure I'm doing my due diligence in regards to reviewing and assuring that the taxpayer dollar is being used to its best possibility. And so with that, I don't know if it's possible to get breakdowns, further breakdowns of contractual and utilities and other operating costs in regards to how those numbers are arrived at. Because right now we're going off of the information in regards to high level, this is what we're spending it on. To me, what I would consider it is kind of milestones, but the devil's in the details. And we want to make sure that as the governing body moves forward with reviewing the budget, that we do review the details. So I don't know if that's possible to get breakdowns of for this. And I'm sure, like I said, it's probably going to be a revolving request to get the breakdowns, how the costs are arrived at for contractuals and utilities and for other operating costs.
Mr. Chair, Councilor Garcia, thank you for the question. I'm going to defer to our finance director and the assistant there. They prepared this roll-ups for our discussion today, but I will ask to refer to Ms. McCoy for breakdowns of the budgets.
Mr. Chair, Councilor, we'd be happy to provide more detailed information.
Okay, awesome. So much. Thank you so much, Director McCoy. I really appreciate that. And like I said, I do see that probably being a revolving request. So I don't know if we can just do that on the front end. That way, as we're going through this week, I can ask any questions in real time, because unfortunately right now I won't be able to ask any questions that might pertain to those kind of details or specifics. And that way I can be prepared for the remainder of the hearings. With that, no other questions, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much, Mr. Brown.
Okay, thank you. Councilwoman Vihil-Coppler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to ask Rich Brown about your budget. Now, we've had a discussion in Economic Development Advisory Committee about the issue with business licenses, and you brought that up. There's some real concern, and I did forward you a voice message from constituent who's very upset about how the business licensing program does not work because, or at least not work online, because it only accepts Chrome. And it's created a great deal of backlog. Of course, you know this in your department with, providing customer service. These licenses are having to be produced manually most of the time, which is a big problem. And I think it affects the workload. And you say you're requesting another position to help with that, but I'm wondering if you have any money in this budget to fix that issue, which is a major issue, and thereby improve the customer service and maybe not have such a need for a dedicated new position for business licensing.
Mr. Chair, Councilor Vihil-Coppler, thank you for the question. Well, there's two things at play, the two issues at play. The Chrome versus other browser issue is a technology issue, and there is a meeting set up this week with our IT group and our business analyst group and the business licensing group to discuss why that technology doesn't do that. I don't know the answer to why it won't allow you to use any browser you want. We're in 2021, but I'm trying to get to the bottom of that part of it. But it is a what they call software as a service application issue, which the IT group and the business analysts are going to help us try to resolve. Second one is the additional staff for business licensing. For me, it's a twofold piece. One is to better our customer service, as you saw from this economic forecasting that Dr. White did, is that we see the economy growing, and so with that, we'll have more licenses, and then we'll also have more issues with licenses. And so we want to be able to traffic the process. We want to be able to answer questions, to renew and issue licenses. So this person will take on that, plus the phone calls that we get, because no one's really coming to City Hall. So that's kind of where I believe this extra person would come into play. Historically, there have been 4 people in that department, and we're down to 2. So I'm just adding one more on top of that.
I think Mr. Gonzalez, you may have an answer specific to the Chrome, because it's a good question. I've run into the same thing from constituents: is why do we have to use that particular program to get our business license?
Mr. Chair, Councilor Vila Koppler, the current version that we are in InterGov CSS Citizen Self-Service was built on the Chrome platform. It is the recommended browser by Tyler, and it is a supported browser by Tyler. With that said, Internet Explorer, Edge, Firefox, several other browsers do work in CSS, but once you start diving deeper in CSS, you will see errors, and Tyler's recommendation is to use Chrome. They will not troubleshoot any errors outside of Chrome, and that is norm in the industry. For example, my personal cell phone service, when I get onto their website, their recommended browser is Edge. I can log on, pay my bill, but once I do a deeper dive, I receive an error. I call them up, and their recommendation is to use their recommended browser, their supported browser, or do it manually. Tyler is telling us that the latest version that they're going to release will support additional browsers. They haven't told us which browsers, and we're looking to update the version by the end of the calendar year to the current version in InterGov CSS.
Thank you for that information. I just want to tell you, it is a big, big problem. It's bigger than what I hear it being admitted to here. There are many people who use iOS now. I mean, Apple products are huge. And so that browser is normally Safari, but there's nowhere else. I had this experience myself, renewing my business license, couldn't do it at all. And it does not say on our business license platform anywhere to the consumer that it only takes Chrome. So I messed around in there forever trying to figure out what was wrong. If it had said, we don't accept anything but Chrome, then, oh yeah, okay. But all of these problems that are occurring out in our city for people who have businesses, not very friendly. I mean, there's many, many calls on this, and it's creating double the workload because every person who can't get this done online calls the office, and it's a big, big problem. Yet when we go to pay our water bills and any of that, it works fine, with any system. So I don't accept that as, well, first of all, I didn't hear you say that the company that we use is going to accept or build in this other platform so that every other user that doesn't have Chrome and most people, I mean, to load another browser on your system just to renew a license or request one is not user friendly, not the friendliest customer service in America. And so I think we really need to address that because it is creating a monstrous workload. And so I would like to know an answer about whether this company is going to allow or what browsers they're going to build into their system by the end of the calendar year. And meanwhile, we ought to have something that's customer service friendly to tell people don't bother using this system to renew your license or get your business license because it only accepts Chrome. There's nowhere that it says that. And I'll just repeat that because it is a bigger problem than I think any of you realize. And I think Rich Brown can attest to that by the voicemail that I forwarded. So I'll get off of that, but I do want an answer on that eventually. And then the next question I have is I want to confirm that the 11 positions to the 11 positions and then the business license one is clearly filling an existing vacancy in economic development. Rich, that's not coming from somewhere else. I just want to confirm that.
Mr. Chair, Councilor Vera Copper, that is correct. We had 11 positions in FY21 and FY22. We had a vacancy. We had 2 vacancies actually, and we're taking one of those vacancies to fill this business licensing role with one left still open.
Okay, thank you. And then another comment I have about, and this is going to be throughout this whole budget, and you know every year I ask this, and not necessarily of Rich, basically, but even probably of Ms. McCoy, is that I don't think we're missing a big piece in budget presentations, which doesn't let us know where these positions are coming from. Like you mentioned earlier, one's coming from Public Works. We don't have that, so we can't track where these positions are going and where they're coming from. And I don't see anything that tells us that. Nor does it tell us whether these positions are part-time, full-time, 3/4 time, what their status is. Are they classified? There's nothing called permanent positions in our language. Those are classified, whether they're classified, exempt, term, or temporary. We never track that. And I think it's when you look at the budget charts that we've received, especially when you look at what's funded through the general fund, it's over 70% of our budget. And there's very different budgeting mechanisms for each of these statuses of these positions, including part-time and full-time status. And so I think that if we could get the position organizational listing, even if we had that, and I would like to request that, then we can track these ourselves if they're not in the budget. And I understand that, and there may still be 2 separate ones, a position organizational listing developed by finance and a position organizational listing developed by HR, which may or may not match. And I'm not sure if they've been reconciled and combined, but I would like to know if I would like to request one, because every year I ask for this and every year we don't have it.
Mr. Chair, Councilor, we'd be happy to provide the information that you requested. We did provide a listing as well as a summary table during our FY20 and our FY21 budget hearings. So what we can do is we can, if you, Lawrence, if you can scroll up to the previous slide. So here, what we have to answer one of your first questions, if there are any changes, again, the transfers that I referenced as an example before, or adding new positions, this is where we're reflecting that information in a summary form. But as I understand it, you're requesting the details. We can go ahead and provide the information. And again, just to address your concern about there being multiple position listings, we have migrated into Tyler Munis for the human capital management system, and that is our master tracking system for all positions in the city. So there is one governing listing that is contained in our human capital system for positions. At the time when we develop our budget, we do extract, actually multiple times during the months-long budget development process, we extract updated, budget lists, human position lists from our human capital management system in order to inform, changes if a position was filled and it wasn't filled the month prior. We want that updated information to be reflected in the budget. So as recently as the month of March, we were able to update the position listing, which built the budget that's in front of you now for the salaries and wages category that we're reviewing. And so that information at that one point in time is different because we are planning for the future. So if there was a new position that was added in economic development, that would have been reflected in the number of new positions in this column and outlined in the changes from FY21 to FY22. That is what you all will see reflected as an additional planner position or additional position that will differ from what is in our Munis financial system, because that's forward looking. Once that particular budget is approved, by council now throughout this 2-week process, we then work very closely with the Human Resources Department to make sure those changes are made in our Tyler Munis Human Capital Management System.
Okay, well, are you saying that when I get this position organizational listing, it's going to be let's say a photo in time of what is currently right now, regardless of what's in this budget request? Is that right?
Mr. Chair, councilors, we did extract the information from the HCM system in March, as I mentioned. So it'll be a point in time from earlier this year, and it will also include the changes that we are recommending for the FY22 budget. For example, those 5 public works positions that I referenced earlier that we are recommending to be added, one of which is related to Midtown, that will be reflected in this the information that we will be providing to council.
So does the positional organizational listing then already include the budget, the position requests in this budget, even though they're not approved?
For the information that we are presenting in front of you, again, future forward looking, we did need to be able to add those positions into our spreadsheets to be able to calculate the cost of the salaries and the benefits for these positions. So yes, the information that we will be providing to you will contain, is based on the FY22 recommended budget. It is not based on currently what is funded.
So how can I get one that's based on current?
It's essentially the difference between what we are including as new positions or what has been transferred versus what was funded last year.
So that means I can't get it.
Mr. Chair, Councilor, we can go ahead and provide you with that information.
Okay, and does it give the detail about whether these positions anywhere are part-time or full-time, whether they're classified, term, exempt, or temporary?
We can include that information, Mr. Chair and Councilor Vigil-Koppler. We'd be happy to.
But it has it already, right?
Yes, Mr. Chair, Councilor, yes.
Okay, when can I get that?
Mr. Chair, Councilor, we will try to provide that information to you as soon as possible.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. And then, oh, well, I guess that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I don't see any other questions. So let's go ahead and move on to planning and land use.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the council. The mission of the Planning and Land Use Department provides expert land use guidance while supporting our community's desired future state. We achieve this by serving the public with integrity and honesty, solving problems through teamwork and creativity, accepting responsibility and accountability, and promoting equity and inclusion. As you see on the screen, this is our breakdown of the department, the 6 divisions that we have in land use plus an admin group. I also want to introduce while I'm here, Jason Kluk, who is the Assistant Land Use Director, who's also on the line and is available for questions, as well as Amanda Insinius, who's the Planning and Land Use Office Manager. Next slide, please. So this is the FY22 recommended budget for planning and land use. We are adding one request is for a $200,000 amount for growth management planning, and then a $150,000 amount to update the land use code. The $150,000, I'd just like to point out, was in previous budgets for land use and was taken out of last year's budget in response to the pandemic. But we are asking to have that amount restored into the land use budget so we can continue with that important land use code update project in FY22. In order to meet the increasing demands of Santa Fe's construction industry partners, while also providing for the life, safety, and welfare of the citizens of Santa Fe, the budget includes 4 new positions and reinstates 4 frozen positions spanning over 3 of the most critical divisions in land use. This is designed to not only restore staffing in the department to a pre-COVID level, but also allow for increased performance and customer service in the department's construction-related operations. There's a $64,000 request for additional funding in the Historic Preservation Division. That money will be used for reimbursable certified local government grant matching funds used to strengthen local historic preservation activities. We have, just on that note, while we're talking about CLG, we are now in our second grant cycle with CLG and hope to continue to work with them moving forward to do good historic preservation planning in the city. There's also funding for a 4% salary increase for non-union employees and a 3% salary increase for myself as department director. And then there's also, as we talked about previously with economic development, there's also increases in other operating costs, including services of other departments. So going into the budget position count, FY21, there were 59 positions. FY22, there's a recommended 63 positions. That's a difference of 4 new positions. And those new positions are 1 construction inspector, 1 plans examiner, and 1 permit technician. And I can talk more about what those job duties will be. Then there's also 1 planner to our current planning group. The reason why that one is sort of set aside is that one is actually not being funded by our general fund, but is actually being funded by impact fees. As you may remember from conversations around the IFCIP work we did late last year, the city is allowed to leverage up to 3% of impact fees towards administration of our impact fees program. And that's what that position is. So we can talk about that in more detail as well. Next slide, please. So this is sort of a breakdown by division, but if we go to the next slide, I think we start to see the breakdown by category, similar to what we discussed with Rich Brown previously. And you start to see where the changes are by division. And then you can also see at the bottom a summary by fund. As you may know, the general fund, or excuse me, the land use planning and land use department is primarily funded by the general fund. There is just want to alert you to a typo on this screen. We are not adding $829,000 from the impact fees fund in the budget. I'll allow Ms. McCoy to talk about that in more detail. But you start to see where the funding for the land use department comes from. Some of that is obviously, the majority of that is obviously general fund. Now some from impact fee funds as we fund that new planner position. Some in transportation grants, that is to fund the MPO division. And then again, that $64,000 in historic preservation, which is actually a small decrease from last year. So with that, I'd like to, again, turn it over to questions. I just remind you that I have Jason Kluk, Assistant Land Use Director here with us, and Amanda Insinius here with us as well. So thank you.
Mr. Chair, councilors, I would like to provide some clarification to the comments that Director Isaacson made. We are requesting a correction to the land use budget today for the impact fee fund, which is the second line in the summary by fund that is on your screen currently. There is a proposed budget for FY22 of $829,748. This is for salaries and benefits. This was budgeted incorrectly for salaries and benefits. As Eli reviewed with you in the previous slide, we are requesting only one position to be added to be funded by the impact fee fund. And that position is a planner position and is funded at $83,077. So we would like to request that the members of the Finance Committee make a technical correction to reduce the budget for salaries and benefits today that is funded out of the impact fee fund and reduce that to $83,077 for the addition of one FTE.
Okay, got it. Councilwoman Villarreal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Isaacson. Just a clarification on the positions again. I understand the 4 new ones. Then there's a coordinator position and 3 frozen positions. Is that correct? Or were all 4 of those frozen positions?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chair, Councilor Villarreal. So there's 4 new positions. The coordinator position that you talked about is one of those 4 new positions. There's also a request for an additional construction inspector in our electrical section, a additional plans examiner in our building permitting group. And then this is listed in the table here. That coordinator position is a permit technician who will be assigned to the admin function in land use, but will really be sort of geared towards assisting customers in areas around permitting, inspections, as well as questions around zoning, making sure that when we get customer questions and inquiries that they're going to the right people. And just as importantly, that we have someone who's responsible for following up on those inquiries with the appropriate staff people to make sure we're being responsive to our customers. So that's really the goal for that position. We're actually then funding 4 positions. We are, we are reinstating 2 construction inspectors, a project administrator in permitting, and that's a really critical role for us that we haven't had this last year, which is really sort of a liaison for our permitting function and really handles a lot of the choreography within the department about working through permitting, technical review, and inspections on projects. And then we also have then a engineer's associate position that is being unfrozen as well. And that was a position that was actually created a number of years ago by my predecessor that was never able to be funded until more recently when we passed our new land use fee schedule. And so now with that additional revenue coming in the city, we're unfreezing that position now for the first time. And so I think that that's really important to point out that, we are, when, conversations around that new fee schedule late last year, we heard from the council and from our constituents that, folks would be willing to pay higher fees if we were going to be able to be more responsive and provide better customer service in our permitting and inspection functions. And so we really focus our new positions and our unfrozen positions to do just that, to add capacity, as Rich Brown was saying, around the sort of critical function in land use, which is supporting our construction and development constituents and partners.
Got it. So those 3 positions existed. They're going to be reinstated with this budget, which is great to hear. And then just to clarify, that planner position that's new, that's being funded by impact fees, is that the same person as the CIC manager, or what you're calling CIC?
Correct. Thank you.
Manager.
CIAC, correct. Thank you for that clarification, Councilor. So CIAC is our Capital Improvements Advisory Committee. and they oversee our IFCIP, which is our Impact Fees Capital Improvements Plan. And you may remember late last year, we adopted a new IFCIP for the city, but at the time we said, we're gonna, this program's gonna take ongoing management to make sure that our impact fee plan tracks with the demands and needs and growth of our community. And so that's what this position will really be focused on, is making sure we are working with the CIAC, that we are updating our plan as needed, and then also that we are creating, tracking the right data and creating the right reports that can inform decision-making around not just impact fees and capital improvements, but also in the areas of long-range planning. And that's really ties in and dovetails nicely with this, with the mayor's growth management proposal that's included in this budget as well.
So that's a full-time position, but you're saying they're not going to be just focused on the CIAC requirements. That doesn't sound like a full-time position, but they'll be integrated into long-range planning.
Well, they will. I don't know if integration into long-range planning is quite the right way of putting it, because we no longer have a long-range planning division. They will be in our current planning division, but they will be responsible for collecting, tracking, and monitoring data and trends around the issue of impact fees and capital improvement expenditures in the city. And so, that's the other part of it. It's not just liaising to the CIAC, but it's also doing the right data collection and management to make sure we're making data-driven decisions around impact fee expenditures in the city. And so they'll also be tasked with that crucial role.
Okay, got it. And then related to long-range planning, I still feel like we need that aspect of our team in land use. So how does the funding that's going towards updating our general plan, actually that piece, and then also the growth management study, how does that then connect back to long-range planning? I mean, I think they're connected. So I'm wondering how you all are going to make that connection with staff, considering we don't have any staff focused on long-range planning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Councilor Villarreal. So the two big contract requests in this budget, growth management planning and land use code update, they are very much connected to one another. The land use code update is really around technical corrections, clarifications, simplifications, and really trying to achieve as much consistency in our existing land use code as possible. As you're aware, over the years, we've done a lot of sort of piecemeal updates to the land use code, and we sort of now have areas of the code that don't jive with one another as well as we need them to. And so that is really what the land use code update is about. And then what it does is it sort of sets the stage then for more substantive updates to the land use code in another phase to really implement the recommendations and ideas that come out of this growth management planning process in conversation with our community. And so how those two projects work together. Now, as we continue to move in the direction of thinking more forward thinking, starting to plan for our future in the city more proactively, we will have to build the staff up to support that ongoing effort. But the initial investment is going to be around using consultants to get out of the gate and really start this meaningful and robust community dialogue around values, principles, and trade-offs. What are we willing to give to get the kind of future we want, the inclusive and equitable future for Santa Fe that we all want. And so that's how we're going to start, but we are going to build up staff. It's my personal opinion. I don't want to create a new siloed division in land use that's assigned long-range planning. My vision is to more get it, build capacity in my planning group so that long-range planning is part of everything we do in land use. It's not just sort of the goal or the task of a few individuals, but it's how we approach the work we do in our entire department. And so I think it'll be, over time, we'll build back more senior planners, more planners. but we'll be building that capacity in our planning function, not in a new division dedicated solely to long-range planning. And that's my vision for the future of the department.
Thank you for sharing your vision. I agree with the silo aspect, and I also feel like we don't have the capacity right now to have our current planners be able to focus on the long-range planning aspects, and that is clear in sector plans and all these other pieces that come together that are all related to growth management planning and the land use code update. So I see it as a both and as you look into the future with your vision. So those are all the questions I have now. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Councilwoman Romero Worth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Was Councilor Cassett Sanchez ahead of me?
One popped up on one side of the screen, and then when you go to the list, you're before.
Okay. I'm sorry. She's up top on the screen, so I thought that we were in a running order. Thank you, Director Isaacson, for your presentation, and I just want to emphasize how important the work on the general plan and the community conversations are around where we're going in the future of this city and the trade-offs and developing the community understanding for what it is we want and what we're working towards. So just want to emphasize the importance of that work, and glad that we're putting some resources behind to start that conversation. And then you and I had a conversation earlier about something that we've all been very concerned about, and that is the enforcement around short-term rentals. And just would like you to kind of share with us how you're tackling that and where that money is, just for general education. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, Councilor Romero Worth, thank you for that question. So as you may have noticed, nothing in this budget is about staffing up in that section that enforces short-term rentals. And the reason why is because that's where my priorities were at the end of FY21. And so we are currently, right now as we speak, building back that section to be able to respond to the needs both of short-term rentals and property maintenance in the city of Santa Fe. And so we are just finalizing right now, hiring a supervisor for that section. I believe the start date for that individual is next Monday. Because that was an internal hire, we're actually going to be able to fill another enforcement specialist position. And then we have another enforcement specialist position currently advertised on the city's website. So we'll be adding in the next few months here quite a bit of capacity to that group for the enforcement of short-term rentals, which aligns nicely with the timing. We are wrapping up our renewals for short-term rentals this week. For those listening in at home, the renewal deadline for short-term rentals is 5 p.m. April 15th, so that's Thursday. After that, we will shift gears and really start to focus heavily on STR enforcement around the issue of unpermitted short-term rentals operating in the city. And so that's going to be the focus. And with these new resources on the team, in addition to our new technological resources, we're hoping that that's a super effective enforcement strategy, and really think that we'll be able to minimize the number of legal operators operating in the city of Santa Fe here this summer. So that's what's in store for STR enforcement over the next 3 or 4 months.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Isaacson. That's all I have.
Okay, Councilwoman Cassette Sanchez.
Very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Director Isaacson, for being here. Couple quick questions. So the permit technician, this is that, what are we calling them? They're technically a permit technician, but it's a community engagement.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Councilor Cassett Sanchez. It's really, we call it internally in our own conversations, it's the traffic cop for land use. It is the single point of contact. You have an inquiry about a land use related issue, not necessarily complaints, but more just inquiries who's responsible for this? I need a question about that. This is the single point of contact that we then task with finding the appropriate party to answer the questions and then following up to make sure that that those questions get answered. I'm glad you asked this question because this position is actually a direct outcome of the public hearing we had maybe a month ago, 6 weeks ago, whenever that was, where the public was able to testify as to where they saw the needs of the city being. And you may remember that Miles Conway, who's the executive director of the Santa Fe Area Home Builders Association, stood up and eloquently talked about the need for a conductor in land use. So many of his constituents are saying, hey, I have questions and I just have a very difficult time getting answers from people in the department. And the reason why that is because our technical staff is so busy working on the actual work that it's difficult for them to find time to actually ask or answer questions about it. And so this position would be that point of contact to make sure that anybody who needs information from land use gets it in a timely fashion. And because a lot of those requests are really about permitting and permitting related questions, that existing job description, I think, is probably most closely aligned to what the actual job duties and responsibilities of that person will be. And so that's how we landed on an additional permit tech request.
Okay, so that being said, will you be then updating a job description to change it from the current permit tech job description to kind of more finely tune what this looks like? Because it's not quite a permit tech, correct?
That's a good question. I haven't thought through all of that yet. If you don't mind letting me get back to you with that in terms of the actual mechanics of getting someone into that position and what some of the upfront HR tasks will be, I'd be happy to talk about that a little bit more. But I haven't actually fully thought through whether we'll be adjusting the existing job description or kind of trying to create a new one. But that's the sort of, I think more than anything, the important takeaway is that's the sort of the band that we're anticipating hiring into, right? Is that sort of that level of the organization.
Thank you. And you and I had this conversation earlier, kind of my thinking about why adding a specific almost community engagement person here as opposed to adding to constituent services. Can you speak a little bit to how are these positions different and why would we not just put another person in constituent services that has a bit more of a land use focus, given so much will also come through us and then we send it over to constituent services?
Thank you. So this is really not intended, thank you, Mr. Chair, Councilor Casas-Sanchez. This is really not a position that's intended to field complaints or CRM type issues. Obviously, some will come through this position and get routed accordingly. But this is really just about things like, I have a question about the zoning code. Can I put a shed in my backyard? What are the setbacks? What are the this, what are the that? Making sure that that person gets a response in a timely manner, or somebody saying, hey, they're not necessarily complaining about the status of their permit. They just need to know what it is. And so this is the person who can run this permit status report and send it back to the constituent in an email. And so it's a point of contact, but it's not necessarily around issues directly related to constituent services. It's more questions very internal to the land use department, just looking for information and resources. So I think they're different in that way. There are some similarities in terms of we really want this person to be responsible for tracking outcomes. So there is some similarities to the incredible job Izzy does in constituent services around tracking those outcomes. But it's, again, a different type of question that we're dealing with, or a different type of sort of inquiry that we're dealing with for this person versus constituent services and what they deal with.
Okay, yeah. So I guess the reason that this is kind of a bit of a challenge for me is sometimes, we have received questions that are about permits. I did one a couple weeks ago about somebody that was having an issue getting their permit. Another one about somebody trying to understand who owned the fence that needed to be repaired. So all of these land use pieces that I send on to Izzy. So I am curious about that interplay, because that's really our direction from the council, and how when we do get those constituent requests that are very specific, not necessarily a CRM or a complaint, but very much a question. So that's something that I'm will be curious to hear how that's worked out in terms of our processes as well, because we have been really instructed everything through Izzy and Christine as part of their tracking of what types of questions and inquiries are coming from constituents. So do you have thoughts on how that interplay works, given that I understand that there's definitely some difference and some specializations of this position versus general constituent services. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that interplay.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, Councilor. I think you're right to identify sort of having to work through some of these processes as this person comes on board, and we figure out exactly the right duties and responsibilities. But I would say that I think ideally, one of the best outcomes of adding this position to land use is that there are fewer people reaching out to you with these questions, because it's very clear to our constituents that we have a person who's responsible and is available to respond to those types of questions within the land use department. I think the reason why we have people reaching out currently to counselors or to constituent services is because we don't have that consistent point of contact within the land use department. And so hopefully by providing that, we'll have fewer folks reaching out and blurring the distinction between, is this a question for Izzy or is this a question for the land use reception traffic cop person? Because more traffic will just be coming directly to our department.
Great. So I'm assuming that there'll be like a standard land use number email
Exactly.
that will go directly to this person.
Correct.
Thank you. And then I did want to jump back to the growth management piece of updating the growth management section of the general plan. Can you talk a little bit more about what is covered in growth management? What topics will we really be exploring through this study?
Absolutely, Mr. Chair, Councilor Cassett Sanchez. So I don't, I think right now it's a growth management study. I don't know if it's exactly going to be, I don't know if calling it an update to the growth management section of the general plan is necessarily 100% precise. It may be handled as its own planning process, but regardless, I think, if I had to put it into broad categories of what the growth management planning process would address and start to ask questions about in terms of a process and outcomes, of course, livability, neighborhoods, preservation, culture, amenities. Obviously, housing is a huge issue. So housing affordability, housing choice, housing equity, homelessness, safety and wellness. So things like public safety, community services, public health, recreation, emergency preparedness, economic health, industry diversification. I think we heard Rich Brum talk about that a second ago. Employment opportunities, living wages, investments in technology and local businesses. Community design, and I think this is a huge one because we hear from a lot of our constituents questions about, does this project look like Santa Fe? And so really thinking about linking things like density, connectivity to architecture, urban design, infrastructure, and transportation. And then obviously environmental quality, starting to really plan in a serious way for climate change and starting to think about our natural resources like air, water, local food production, and then our open spaces and landscapes. So those are some of the broad topics that I think a growth management plan would really start to engage the community about. But again, it's really about, trying to make sure that as we grow, as we provide the housing that we all recognize this community needs, that we're not fundamentally changing the character of Santa Fe, that at the end of the outcome is still something that's quintessentially us and is really about preservation of our identity. And so that's what I think a lot of the conversation will be about during this planning process.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for providing a little bit more information there. And I want to echo what Councilwoman Villarreal had mentioned about, and one of the things that I've really been thinking about is how does this really jumpstart us into doing more of the consistent long-range planning, the ongoing long-range planning. We've had so many conversations recently about the need for long-range planning, the need to be more proactive, that our general plan is, I don't know, 22 years old. And so I am, you've spoke about it. If there's anything more to add about how does this really start to help us move in that direction? Is it something that I have heard loud and clearly from plenty of people, from watching planning commission meetings, from some of the planning commissioners, from my own experience and dealing with land use cases? And I do think that it's really crucial that we start to look at that and that we invest dollars in it and that we make sure that we're putting the money there. So giving you an opening to talk about those investments that we need to be making.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Councilor Casas-Sanchez. You and I have had conversations about this. I think the first step really is making sure that we develop a growth management plan that is implementable, that's really implementation focused. And then when we have a plan in place, to then start building up the staff that's really sort of dedicated towards making sure that the policy recommendations and ideas in the growth management plan that the mayor's sponsoring really gets implemented in a meaningful way. And that means being prescriptive in certain areas of the plan, but it also means having people who are actively within the land use department, actively involved in developing that plan, and then are given the responsibility of making sure it's implemented. And I don't think to do that, you necessarily need to have a long-range planning division, but I think you need to have planners on board. And fortunately, we have a great staff right now that are really thinking about the future of the city and are really committed to, a lot of the smart growth principles and ideas that growth management planning produces.
That, and I agree. I think that really just building up support in the planning division. And as I've mentioned to you, your planners have been wonderful to work with. So definitely want to make sure that they get the support that they need. I have no further questions. Thank you so much.
Okay, Councilwoman Vihil-Coppler, and then I'd like to wrap up with a motion for the Planning and Land Use Department. And then also we got to go back and make a motion on economic development, hopefully before 4 o'clock. Councilwoman Vihil-Coppler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to ask Mr. Isaacson if the supervisor of that you're hiring for the short-term rental program, is that a working supervisor who also goes out in the field to troubleshoot issues?
Mr. Chair, Councilor Vihil-Coppler, yes, that position is envisioned to be a working supervisor. Right now, that individual, prior to being hired as the full-time supervisor, was the acting supervisor in that section for many months, and worked as a working, supervisor, helping out tremendously in short-term rentals and in other areas around special events and other things like that historically, and we'll be doing that again more as more things open up. So that role is certainly envisioned to be a working supervisor.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, there's been some chatter about who does inspections of short-term rentals. What I have heard about that is that that's going to be responsibility of the short-term rental or planning and land use division, no longer the fire department. Where does that stand now, and how, and if it is being done or expected to be done by the planning and land use department, where does that fit in this budget?
Mr. Chair, Councilor Vihil-Coppler, thanks for the question. And so one of the, when updating the short-term rental ordinance late last year, it came to our attention through conversations with the fire department that the fire department in their chapter, I believe it's 12, but I could be wrong, so don't hold that against me. But in their chapter of the code, they had classified short-term rentals as a commercial occupancy when really they should have been categorized as a residential occupancy. And so because of that, the fire department no longer was required to do those inspections. And by having the fire department do those inspections, they were actually being tasked with something to inspect something that they probably shouldn't have been inspecting. And so what we did is we changed that section of the fire code, the local fire code, and added the elements that the fire department were looking for to our short-term rental checklist, things like fire extinguishers, carbon monoxide monitors, things of that nature, egress maps, those types of things, and added that to our standard short-term rental inspection that the short-term rental division or section was already doing. And so those will continue to be done by short-term rental inspections. But now the inspectors are just looking for a few more items as part of their inspection. And we saw this as a real win-win for the city, because now instead of sending 2 inspectors out to a property, which is actually really inconvenient for our short-term renters, our hosts, we now only have to send 1 inspector out, which is more convenient for our customers and also saves the city money on staffing. So that's where we are. There's nothing in the budget that's necessarily going to show that sort of land use's involvement in the inspections, because it was something we were already doing. So that's why there's nothing in the budget that really pops out on that topic.
Some of those inspection items though require certification, and I don't recall any of those job descriptions having that. So what are you doing if you're assigning this duty to someone who doesn't have the certification, and if they are getting it, is their position being upgraded for that extra certification, which does require a price tag of sorts?
Mr. Chair, Councilor Vila-Koppler, that's a great question. So when we made this change, this came up. We did have a member of staff who brought this to my attention, concerned that he would be asked to do additional duties that required certifications that he happened to have and wanted to be compensated as such. And we worked with the fire department to determine that it's actually just a visual inspection and that no certifications were actually required to identify these additional elements that we added to the short-term rental inspection checklist. And as such, that it was not appropriate to add to that job description or to the compensation for the individuals doing that work.
So the additional supervisor can also do those inspections?
That is correct. Anyone in that section can do these inspections.
Without certification?
That's my understanding, yes.
That's your understanding from the fire department?
From talking to the fire department and talking to my team in short-term rentals, it's my understanding that because it's simply a visual inspection, we're not actually inspecting the equipment itself, but just simply making sure that the equipment is available on site, that there's no certifications required for that inspection, and therefore anyone in that section can do those types of inspections moving forward.
Okay, thank you. I'll double check that because I'm not quite so sure, but okay. The other question I wanted to ask you to remind me, do the impact fees have an end date?
They do. They do. That's a great question. Thank you, Counselor. So the impact fees, I believe, are the way the Development Fees Act is written, are designed to be expended within 7 years. And so that is the time limit on impact fees. So within 7 years of collection, they're intended to be expended.
Okay, so that goes back to my discussion earlier about the types of positions that we hire into, and the planner position you say is going to be funded by impact fees. So that position should be classified as a term position. And it makes a difference because those are the expectations under which people are hired, and it has to do with property rights to a job. And if those expectations are recruited with that caveat, it saves a lot of grief and such in the end when those impact fees are gone and maybe future city councils decide we don't need those impact fees anymore. We're going to go a different route for funding. So this is why I believe this is just a general comment where we need to be paying a lot more attention to the statuses that we assign, not only to the current positions we have, but future positions, because those lead to recruitment agreements. And it's very, very important. Then I wanted to ask Ms. McCoy a question that I forgot to ask earlier, which is what percentage of, you call it low vacancy rate, and I call it sanding or a vacancy credit that we take. What is that amount? A percentage amount? Is Ms. McCoy here?
Mr. Chair, councilors, the percentage is different for different divisions. So we can go ahead and provide that information to you as well. For example, based on the number of FTE for the admin division within planning and land use, there was no vacancy credit taken. However, the building permit division, based on the size of that division, number of FTEs, staff has taken a 3% vacancy credit in that one. So 3%, I believe, and either Andy or Alexis can weigh in on this, was the, if we did take a vacancy credit for FY22, was the amount, the percentage that we took. That being said, when I worked at the state or in other local governments, the vacancy credit was always much higher given the natural level of attrition, obviously not in a small department like affordable housing, which is 4 or 5 people, but in larger departments, when we start to look at public utilities or even public works, and we get into 200 or 300 employees, the attrition can be a lot higher than that 3%.
Thank you. I don't recall, well, sometimes, vacancy credits are taken, but then there's no vacancies. So I don't recall during mid-year budgets that we have ever given those credits back. And so, how do we handle that?
I think that's why we've taken the approach that if it is a smaller division or department, or a lower level of natural attrition for any particular reason, given the positions or the classifications, the staff did not take a vacancy credit. So it's more of a scalpel approach than an across the board.
Okay, thank you. Those are all the questions I have, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, move to approve this budget.
Okay, Andy, if you could include in the motion to reduce in the land use administration division, the impact fees, salaries and wages category by $746,671, leaving $83,077 to fund the addition of 1 position.
So moved.
Is there a second? Okay, can I have a roll call vote, please?
Counselor Cassett-Sanchez,
Yes.
Counselor Villarreal,
Yes.
Counselor Lindell,
Yes.
Counselor Romero Worth,
Yes.
and Counselor Beta.
Yes. Okay, can I have a motion regarding the economic development budget?
Move to approve.
Second.
Okay. And does that include direction to further discuss the project manager position when we either at council or when we discuss the public works department budget?
Yes.
Okay, is Councilwoman Cassette-Sanchez, does that pretty much address your and Councilwoman Villarreal's concerns?
Yes, it does for the present moment. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Can I have a roll call, please?
Counselor Cassett-Sanchez,
Yes.
Counselor Villarreal,
Yes.
Counselor Lindell,
Yes.
Counselor Romero Worth,
Yes.
Counselor Beta.
Yes. Okay, so that concludes the budget hearings for April 13th. We will pick up tomorrow with affordable housing, and then arts and culture, then tourism, and then hopefully get back on track with public works. Ms. McCoy, we may want to give notice to our unions that we may not have time to get to them tomorrow, so we may have to reschedule that. Just hopefully we can get back on track, but we're already behind. So if you could at least put them on notice, and we'll keep an eye on that as we move forward during tomorrow's hearings. Anything else from the finance director?
Not at this time, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Okay, so with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,